You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, Will.
Hello, David.
Hello, everybody, and happy Darwin Day. Welcome to episode 237 of Common Descent, a podcast where we talk about paleontology, evolution, the history of life on Earth, and around Darwin Day, February 12th, which is a little bit before this episode drops, we have a bit of a tradition of talking about historical figures, or in this case, historical events in paleontology and related histories. This episode, our topic is the Dinosaur Renaissance. This is a period of time and a protracted event that sees the transition from early 1900s understanding of dinosaurs to a more modern understanding of dinosaurs, involving a bunch of cool new discoveries, the revitalization of some earlier ideas that re-rise to prominence. This episode, we're going to talk about the whole thing. We're going to go from before it, through it, to after it. And I am absolutely delighted to say that we will be joined by a special guest to share with us their insights into the Dinosaur Renaissance after the announcements, after the news, and after the break. We will welcome to the podcast Riley Black to tell us all about 1900s dinosaur history.
It was so much fun. It's so good stuff. It's awesome.
Tons of fun. We love Riley. Riley was on the podcast a little while ago to promote her new book, When the Earth Was Green, which is awesome. I know that she is currently working on another new book that is in the works. So after this episode, if you can't get enough of listening to Riley talk about dinosaur and paleontology history, fortunately, she's written a bunch of books, so you could go check those out.
Somewhat prolific.
This episode is also inspired by a bunch of requests from our listeners. Every topic we do is requested by our audience. In this case, this topic comes to us thanks to requests from Johnny, Paleo Rob, Kel, Jesse, Laura, Klaus, Big Boss Man, Les, Peter, Monica, and Karen.
Thank you, everyone. Good requests, because this was a fun topic.
Keep those requests coming. Before we go any further, some announcements, some reminders. We have a Patreon. The support that we get from our patrons allows us to do everything we do with the podcast, both moral support and financial support. We appreciate it immensely. Tons of goodies for patrons on the Patreon. We do director's notes. We do bonus noise, which includes bonus news, which the February's version of that, I believe, will be coming out the same day as this episode, same weekend. So if you're a patron, make sure to go listen to that. Also, at certain levels, patrons get their names shouted out here on the podcast when they join us this episode. We would like to welcome new patrons, Tim and Fairsaw.
Welcome. Thank you for the support.
Dear listener, if you would like to support us on Patreon and enjoy all of the cool bonus goodies, find the link in the episode description. Hey, there's some other stuff going on out there in the world of Common Descent. This episode is February, and in February we are releasing Poke-E, our special Spook-E side series where we are evolving legendary Pokemon. By the time you're listening to this, the first 2 episodes of Poke-E will be out, so you can hear me and Will discuss the hypothetical evolution of Lugia and Giratina. And I'm so happy with how these have turned out. And I'm so excited to release, especially the next one. The 3rd episode of this series is a real whopper. Also happening this month, at the end of February, the 1st episode of Bricks with Basque for the year will be coming out. And next month, Will, over on the Bricks with Basque series, is going to start doing live Lego builds, which is going to be very fun.
Yes, I got all the pieces, and I'm ready to go for that.
Gonna be fun. We announced some of these upcoming projects and changed projects in our anniversary live stream at the end of January. If you didn't watch it and you want to check in on the upcoming cool stuff, our special announcements, and also just our rambly chit-chat, that's archived on our YouTube channel. So you can go and rewatch it as many times as you like until we come out with the next one. And finally, we've got mail.
Absolutely. We got 2 pieces of mail. One was our annual Valentine's from Mark, who likes to send us fun little silly Valentines. And these time included some anatomically correct Valentine's Day heart stickers.
Adorable.
I love. And then we also got sent copies of the Let's Botanize book. One for me, one for
Yes.
David.
We had Ben and Jacob on last episode in the news to talk about Let's Botanize, their new book, all about how to observe and appreciate the plants in the world around you. I am so excited to have a copy of this book because, as longtime listeners will know, I know nothing about plants. And this book, what I like about the book is that there is like detailed descriptions and in-depth knowledge if you want it, but I think it also serves very well as plants for dummies.
Yes.
And that's me. I'm a dummy who needs to know about plants.
Yes. and the book's pretty, and like the front is all textured on the leaves, and it's cool. I like this book.
Very cool. Hey, David from the future here. One more thing. Many of our listeners are probably aware of the ongoing conversation in paleontology about certain very famous paleontologists being involved with certain very famous evil, awful humans, and the resulting bigger conversation about long-held difficulties and challenges and struggles in the field of paleontology. We're not going to go into that right now, but if you're interested in hearing more about it, our friends Amy and Megan over on their podcast, Weird and Dead, dedicated a whole episode to talking about this issue, broader issues within paleontology, including some of their personal experiences. And it goes a long way to dissecting why this has become such a seismic event in the field of this science. As always, Weird and Dead is not for children, and this particular episode is not necessarily a fun listen, but it is very important. And kudos to Amy and Megan for putting this conversation and some of their experiences on their podcast. That is not easy to do, and it's really important for people to get to hear about that. So go check that out, Weird and Dead, and also listen to their other episodes because they're a riot. They're fantastic. Without further ado, let's do the news. Every episode before we get into our main topic, we talk about some recent science news that keeps us all up to date. Will, what news have you brought to share with the class today?
Sleepy jellyfish.
Aw.
Yeah.
Adorable. Wait, do jellyfish sleep?
Yes, they do.
All right, teach me.
I'm super excited for this because I saw it and I was like, ooh, as I've mentioned, whenever I see a news that is an update to an episode I've done.
Yes. Episode 161 was sleep. I put this one on the news list and I was like, I'm going to put this way up at the top so that Will sees it.
Yep. This is research by Raphael Aguilon et al. In Nature Communications, and the article is by Timothy Hearn in The Conversation. So, sleep, as we discussed in our sleep episode, is a bit of a mystery as to what the exact biological purpose it serves is. It's been debated over the centuries that we have been trying to understand what sleep is and why we sleep. And one of the more recent and more supported, or at least seems to make the most sense and line up with most of the evidence we have, that one of the main reasons for sleep is not actually for the functioning of our brain as far as like thoughts and memories, but for the physical maintaining of our nervous system. That during sleep, we can do housekeeping, so to speak, and flush our nervous system of metabolic waste that builds up as we use our nerves throughout the day.
Because our nervous system is running a marathon constantly.
Yes.
And you need to stop running a marathon for a little bit.
They noted that like we have evidence, different studies of like when mice sleep, their spinal cord fluid surges through the brain and washes away this waste. And that when they also noted that in some cases, some DNA breaks are mended during sleep, especially DNA breaks in these nervous cells. Another study noted that in zebrafish, nerve cell repair of DNA was able to happen during sleep from damage that built up while the animal's awake.
Mm-hmm.
So this maintenance purpose of sleep has become a much more common and widely held view of why we sleep. But if this is the case, it could be a nervous system feature and not a brain feature.
This is where the jellyfish come in.
Yes, because very famously, jellyfish and cnidarians, the jellyfish, anemones, and corals, do not have brains, but they do have nervous cells. They do have a nervous system. And it was always thought in the past, like our early days of trying to understand sleep, that it's a brain thing, and that's the important part. That's why, it's associated with memory preservation and things like that. But if it is to maintain the nervous system, it could go back before brains to just the origin of nervous systems. We talked about this in the sleep episode. There is evidence of jellyfish sleeping, specifically the ones both in this study and previous ones that have been noted are upside down jellyfish, which sit on their bells and with their tentacles pointing up, and they photosynthesize. So they basically just become little plants as they slowly pulse to just keep themselves on the sandy seafloor. And that they've noted during night cycles, the pulsing slows in a very similar pattern to the circadian rhythm that we and other animals share when we sleep. And that if you disturb them during that time, they will even sleep for longer the next night when they're able to.
They're making up their sleep debt.
Yeah, they have sleep rebound. So we've known that it seems they also have sleep. This study is trying to determine what is that sleep doing for them, and how does that sleep truly function. So they looked at upside down jellyfish and starlit sea anemones. First issue was, how do you detect when a jellyfish or sea anemone is asleep?
Right, they don't even have a nostril, so you can't look for the snot bubble.
They can't snore.
They don't have a mouth, so they can't. None of the classic signs.
Yeah, so we know Z's coming up. The way they looked at it is they looked for the slowed pulsing of the bells for the jellyfish and lack of movement in the anemone. And the way they tested whether this does count as sleep is they would, during those sessions and outside of them, flash them with pulses of white light and little pulses of food. And both of those should get a reaction, but during these phases of, for the jellyfish, pulses below 37 beats per minute, and anemones that had been still for at least 8 minutes, both showed reduced reaction times.
Okay, which is another defining feature of sleep.
That they had to wake up, it seems, from these reduced activity times. All of this lines up with being sleep. Sleep as we and other animals know it. They also were able to map the sleep patterns of them, which is fun. That like the jellyfish slept at night and napped at midday in both laboratory and natural situations.
Cute.
Yep. And that the anemones, their sleep increased at dawn, and that they both had slightly different things that seemed to be what was regulating the pattern of sleep, like circadian rhythm and homeostasis being different aspects. And they both seemed to sleep about 1/3 of the day, which is similar to us. So similar amount of sleep. So now they wanted to look into what seems to cause the sleeping. They stained nerve cells in the tissues of the jellyfish and were able to mark DNA breakage happening. So like where it happens, they were able to see it with this. And then they were able to track when the DNA is breaking and when it's getting repaired. And indeed, DNA breakage increases during activity, so during the day, and drops after a long rest.
Get your spell slots back and everything.
Yep. Yeah, they used the phrase long rest in the article.
A jellyfish takes a long rest at night and a short rest in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
To, just a little refresh, spend some of those hit dice.
They even tested how this affected if the animals did not get sleep, and they kept them awake by changing the tank's water currents. So they disturbing them enough that they couldn't sleep. And both the DNA breaks increased and the sleeping time increased the next time they got to, which is that sleep rebound, to test whether this was a cause and effect of the DNA breaking and the sleeping. They used ultraviolet light to do extra damage. UV light, which comes from the sun, is damaging your DNA when it hits, and that's just what it does. It is a very high energy wavelength. This treatment doubled the number of DNA breaks within an hour and prompted extra sleep during that same day.
Oh, fascinating.
Yes.
Which is fascinating to think that, like, when your body tells you that you're tired,
Yeah.
one of the things that it may be telling you is, hey, too much of your DNA is broken.
Yes. Yeah, you have taken too much damage.
Yes.
You need to sleep. It's the red glowing screen in a video game.
Yes.
And they noted that after they rested, DNA breakage returned back toward baseline amounts, and then they went back to normal daytime, nighttime rhythms. This, though, is probably the craziest part to me. I would have never bet this in a million years. They then added to the water melatonin.
Okay.
Which, for anyone out there who's ever had trouble falling asleep like myself, these are the melatonin gummies and things that we can buy today to help us get to sleep. And when they added it to the water, it caused both species to increase their dozing lengths. Even during active times, it could increase the amount of time they'd sleep or initiate it.
Wow.
Yeah.
We're not so different, jellyfish and we.
And this, they noted, was very surprising because it was thought that melatonin's role in our nervous system did not evolved alongside vertebrates and the evolution of more complex brains and circadian rhythms. So this suggests it is a much earlier evolutionary response, which all of this, if this is indeed, what they're seeing, does indicate that sleep seems to be, at least if not only, heavily, maybe primarily meant to give our bodies a time to flush our nervous system of waste and repair DNA damage, that this trait for sleeping probably goes back over 600 million years ago, when the lineages for cnidarians and the lineages that would lead to worms and insects and vertebrates split. So the basically the origins of nervous systems, animals may have been sleeping since then.
Someone's gotta study sponges.
Yep.
Tell me if sponges are sleeping. This is a really cool study because not only does it help reinforce this idea of what the function of sleep, but also reveals a bunch of surprising similarities between sleep in us and jellyfish, which is about as distant as animals can get. That's about as far away in relationship as you can get before it's a mushroom.
Yeah, exactly. So this really does seem to show that sleep has a very deep origin in animal ancestry. And they made a point to note that this does not like close the case on what sleep is, because sleep is probably serving multiple functions, but there does seem to be a lot of evidence. They noted other studies that have seen that in sleep deprived mice and fruit flies, you can note a increase in DNA damage and buildup of metabolism byproducts that can cause other issues, so that it seems that lack of sleep causes damages like we are seeing being repaired here to build up, notably. So it does seem that sleep and repairing of these day-to-day degradation is a one-to-one connection, and just how much and how widely it's affecting. They noted that we also should look at other organisms sleeping in different conditions, like deeper water, colder water, other habitats. These were both animals that are going to be encountering circadian sunlight rhythms. Other animals in other situations might have different sleep patterns, and sleep might have a different relationship. But this does seem to be a big bit of evidence for one of the main factors of sleep, which is so cool.
Very cool. We'll go ahead and tack this on to the end of episode 161. Also, episode 121 about brains. This seems relevant to go over there, too.
Yep. Yeah, I saw it and I was like, ooh, more data. And it was so good.
That's awesome. Well, sometimes you gotta sleep, and sometimes you gotta go fast. And my next news is about the evolution of adaptations for fast running and covering long distances in hoofed mammals in North America.
Cool.
This is research published in the Journal of Mammalogy by Fabian Hardy and Ann Court, and we will link in the blog post to a press release on phys.org by Morgan Sherburne of the University of Michigan. Here in North America, we are home to lots of artiodactyls, which are the even-toed hoofed mammals. We've got deer, we've got moose and bison and things like that. In the broader Americas, we also have a bunch of camel family animals, llamas and alpacas and stuff. Some of these species are particularly long-legged and particularly fast running, that they are built for either moving quickly or covering lots of ground or both, which has raised obviously lots of questions about when and why that trait became prevalent in some of these groups. Some authors have suggested that this might be related to changing environments. One of the things that happened over the last several million years in North America is the loss of forests as they were replaced by more open grassland habitats. And in a grassland, there's room to roam and run. Others have suggested that it might have been pressure from predators. The famous example of this here in North America is pronghorns, which are notoriously overfast.
Oh,
but
yeah.
they are faster than they seem to need to be. And one of the famous hypotheses for explaining this is that we used to have cheetahs in North America. Now, there has been back and forth over exactly how cheetah-like these American cheetahs were and if they were fast like cheetahs, but the suggestion that having fast predators around might have reinforced this evolution of speed. This study basically takes a look at a section of North American artiodactyls in the fossil record to look at when do we see these adaptations for cursoriality, right, running or covering long distances, and when do we see them change.
Cool.
They looked at ankle bones of fossil antilocaprids, which is the pronghorn family, and camelids, the camel, llamas, and alpacas, from the Dove Spring Formation in California, which dates to the Miocene, ranging from about 8.5 to about 12.5 million years ago. So this is a formation that covers several million years of geologic time. During that time, there is a shift in the local environment from more forested to increasingly grassland or open woodland. So this is a great case study to look at, all right, what changes do we see in these animals? They specifically were looking at an ankle bone called the astragalus, which very famous among mammal researchers. The proportions of this ankle bone are known to be related to locomotion and body size. So this bone pretty reliably shifts with these features. Among modern species, and this has also been interpreted in the past, a proportionately shorter astragalus is correlated with animals that live in more open habitats, more grasslands, open woodlands. This is a shift to that kind of open habitat lifestyle.
It's always fun when I hear about this bone can be indicative of how they're moving or where they're living. And sometimes it's very easy to be like, yeah, okay, I can guess what feature will go with each of but every now and then it's like, I don't know what the ankle, I don't know that I would have guessed, but interesting that it's the shorter one for the more open. Huh.
And I didn't look super deeply into this, but it has to do with the way that the bone is functioning in the leg.
Yes.
That shortening it allows for movement in the particular way that is good for these long-legged, long-moving animals. So the whole study here was, what changes do we see in these ankle bones as we go through this period of environmental change? And the answer was no change. They did not detect any significant change in these ankle bones or the then inferred methods of moving around and locomoting through their habitat. In fact, they noted that the early species in this range already looked pretty much identical to modern species ankle bones.
Okay.
These included like early pronghorns, which were smaller than modern. So like size has changed, and whatever changes come along with that. But the adaptation of that ankle bone and the way that they are moving their feet as they go over the land has not significantly changed. This is interesting. First, because as the press release makes it a point to emphasize, because it's a cool note, early pronghorns were, it seems, similarly running adapted as modern pronghorns millions of years before the American cheetahs showed up in North America.
Yeah.
Which does seem to suggest they were already like that.
Yeah.
Before these predators that have been suggested to have maybe led to it. It also suggests that both the pronghorns and the camelids didn't have to change this aspect of their morphology when the environment shifted. The authors suggest that probably what we're seeing here is that they may have changed their behavior without actually having to change their morphology. The ability to roam wide distances or to run quickly would have allowed them to continue accessing different habitats, even as, patches of forest became more spread out or grasslands became more expanded. So it seems that they were already efficient at travel. And then because they were already pretty good at it, they were probably just able to adjust their behavior to manage the new shape of the ecosystem without actually having to evolve a new style of getting around.
Yeah, very interesting. Oh, that's cool.
It also sounds like, if I was reading the description correctly, they noted that the ankle bones were consistently different between the camel family and the pronghorn family. And it sounded like the camels were consistently more cursorial adapted. Like they were a little bit better in that, a little more functional in that regard, which suggests different strategies, that the two groups of animals weren't doing the exact same thing. They were being flexible, but in slightly different ways. The authors point out that this is interesting because not only is it relevant to understanding how these hoofed mammals have changed over time, but also relevant to predicting future changes as our behavior, our actions, humans, change landscapes, right? By expansion of farmlands or modifying landscapes or removing forests, and also the effects of climate change. Altering these habitats, this kind of study helps us to understand what sort of changes we might expect to see in response to them.
Very cool. These are really cool findings, and they're good like reminders that while anatomy is great for telling us what animals would be potentially capable of and better at, like this animal has adaptations that would make it better at A than B, or we can see that it starts, they evolve to be more and more adapted to, this kind of moving around or whatever it is. But that does not give us the end answer to what the animals were doing or how they were doing it. Behavior can dictate a whole bunch. And this is a great example. Like, yeah, they were already fast or mobile. That's a good. They were already very mobile animals. Then the environment shifted and they used that mobility probably in a different way, but they were not just suddenly more mobile. They were already mobile beforehand. And there's lots of reasons that could be, like if they were already migrating, even before being open habitat specialists, well, if you still have to travel halfway across the country, then it's good to be good at that. So there's already reasons they could have been good at that before that. But I like when we get reminded of, you can't just take the shape of an animal as the archetype that animal for sure filled, because animals can change their mind and start behaving differently as they adjust.
Yeah, that there's more than one way to adapt to a situation.
Yes. And some of them don't fossilize.
Yes.
Behavior does not fossilize, so we have to remember that maybe they just started doing things differently and eating different things, or living in different places, and they just learned new behaviors to survive.
I love a study where the results are that the hypothesis was wrong.
Yeah.
This is a great example of a study where they went, okay, our hypothesis is that we expect to see this happen because that reinforces our understanding of how this process works.
It makes total sense, like completely reasonable thing to expect.
Yep. Well, we didn't see that, which is more interesting.
Yep.
Because that means that our assumption about how this thing works is wrong. So
Yeah.
now what does that mean for our understanding of this process? Very cool stuff.
So odd. Well, and it's also fun because it's so often when we see something like pronghorns that are super fast, we want to go, okay, like what? There's got to be some. You are unusually fast. There's got to be an unusual reason for it. And sometimes the answer is no. That was a useful thing for them for some reason. It doesn't actually have to be an exciting reason. It could just be that they were particularly, and that whatever it was, something about the combination of their features means they are especially good at it. And that's it. Just luck of the genetic draw. They are one of the fastest animals on our planet.
Because it's good getting place to place.
Yeah, this is why get there later when I can get there now.
That's how I've always lived my life.
Well, speaking of efficiently moving around, flighted animals are some of the most efficient movers, but very high energy, and this requires special features. This study is looking at some new features identified on Archaeopteryx that might be identifiers for flighted dinosaurs.
Oh, fun.
Yeah. This is research by Jingmai O'Connor et al. In The Innovation, and the article is by Andrew Paul in Popular Science. So, powered flight takes a lot of energy. It is a very energy intensive way to get around, which means you need to fuel a flying body. And so it has long been suggested and suspected, and there's evidence for the evolution of flight also coinciding and going along with the evolution for more efficient feeding and more efficient food acquisition, because you now need to get food very quickly and the right kinds of food to fuel your flying body. This has been noted in things like modern birds having a lot of specializations to the beak and face and feeding apparatus that help them in feeding. Things like them having very sensitive bills, making them very efficient with that beak, being able to manipulate things very well.
Episode 227, beaks.
Having highly mobile tongues to help get things in.
Episode 192.
Oh, yeah.
Tongues. Keep saying words.
And then oral papillae, which aren't quite teeth, but they're very similar.
Yes. Episode 88, teeth. Oral papillae, episode TBD.
Yeah, don't say a number because they'll hold us to it.
They will. Yeah, they'll remember.
These are the mouth spikes that like penguins and stuff have that help maneuver the food in. These have all been associated with, more efficient feeding mechanics in birds. When we look at the evolution of birds,
episode 37.
Yep. Early birds and early relatives of birds look very similar. And it's often difficult to tell who was a flying bird or bird-like dinosaur and who wasn't a flying but yet very feathery bird-like dinosaur. This research was looking at a specimen of Archaeopteryx and identified some features. This is a very well-preserved Archaeopteryx, and they were able to get a look at some of these features and identify that they seem to have been there from the earliest birds and may be a way to identify a flying dinosaur.
Ooh.
This specimen, they very carefully, like the article goes into that, how they very carefully removed layer upon layer to try to keep an eye out for any soft tissue preservation and things like that. And using UV light, they were able to get some fluorescence of soft tissue remains in the rock. They described that one of the things they found was in the beak area, they found two glowing dots, small glowing dots, and they did not know what it was until they started to reference bird anatomy and other bird specialists and noted that they are very similar to oral papillae, the mouth spikes. And these seem to be evidence that Archaeopteryx had some mouth spikes in its inside to help maneuver food toward the throat.
fascinating because
Yes.
Archaeopteryx had teeth.
Yes, it did. Yep.
And we often think, well, because you look at like the mouth of a goose or a duck or whatever,
Uh-huh.
and they've got those little ridges, and we often think of those as being a replacement for teeth.
Uh-huh.
But in this case, it seems like they are a buddy. They're complementary.
Yes, that it's to add efficiency to feeding, to move the food backwards quickly and directly. They also found some other features. There are some fragments, splinters of what seem to be the tongue bone.
Cool.
And based off of it, it does seem to suggest that Archaeopteryx had a similarly mobile tongue to what we see in modern birds. And then CT scans found enlarged nerve endings in the beak, some big neurovascular openings in the tip of both the upper and lower beak, which suggests that the neural system in the beak extended out of the bone. This is a very similar pattern we see in modern birds that forms what's known as the bill tip organ, which is a sensory organ in modern birds for letting their beak be like a fingertip and sense the world very acutely while they're manipulating stuff with this beak. So they have these three features that seem to be features that go along with the evolution of flight, goes back to the earliest bird, and could be things that evolved to help increase this feeding efficiency. And if this is something that indeed evolved with flight, means that if we find these features in another dinosaur that we were questioning whether it could fly, it might be potential evidence that it was flighted or close to flighted.
Yeah, it's an interesting question with Archaeopteryx, especially because it could be that it had begun to fly and these features had developed because there was pressure to have more efficient feeding, or were these features present before birds began flying, and because they had this efficient feeding method, they were able to develop flight. My next question is, go look at Microraptor.
Yep.
What do we see in Microraptor? Because the consensus seems to be that Microraptor flew. Does it have similar evidences of efficient feeding adaptations?
Yeah. So yeah, I want to know so much more. I wouldn't be surprised if this is difficult to study because it sounds like this was only able to be found because it was a really nice specimen.
Yeah.
So hopefully we find similar ones.
Archaeopteryx is like the size of a crow, and it's made of bird bones.
Yep.
Which not great for detailed preservation of tiny features. Go over to the Jehol biota and get some of those birds.
Yeah. Oh yeah, please do.
Well, speaking of late Jurassic dinosaurs, our last bit of news is a new study about the food web of late Jurassic North America and what it tells us about how different dinosaurs in that ecosystem were involved in their local food webs.
Cool.
This is a cool study. The results are, I would say, unsurprising, but very cool to have. Here's some numbers that tell us what we may have suspected was already the case.
Yay.
This is research by Cassius Morrison. I don't know if there's any relation there. Et al. Published in the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science Bulletin, and we will link in the blog post to an article in Discover magazine by Anastasia Scott. The Morrison Formation, that was the comment that I made before. The Morrison Formation is a famous geologic formation from the late Jurassic of North America. It's famous because it has a ton of dinosaurs in it. It's a very complete ecosystem as fossil sites go. And it has a ton of famous dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Stegosaurus, Apatosaurus, Brontosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, Allosaurus. There's tons of them. It includes lots of predatory dinosaurs of all sizes, small, middle, and large, including Allosaurus and Torvosaurus. Lots of ornithischians like stegosaurs and ornithopods. And perhaps most famously, not just one or two types of sauropods, but at least 6 or 7 different genera of sauropods. The big, long-necked, long-tailed dinosaurs like Apatosaurus and Diplodocus. It is one of the most examined ecosystems in Earth history when it comes to the question of who was eating what and what were the relationships between these different animals. This study is an analysis specifically of the Dry Mesa Dinosaur Quarry. This is a locality located on the Colorado Plateau that preserves a diverse Morrison Formation ecosystem over the course of several thousand years. So, like a nice little chunk of time. This quarry includes not only lots of fossil evidence of who lived there, but lots of dietary evidence. Research has done studies on tooth wear, on chemical isotopes, on stomach contents to give us some ideas of what dinosaurs were eating what kinds of things. Here in this study, the researchers took all of this data and plugged it into statistical analyses that are designed to help us understand modern ecosystems.
Cool.
This is something that modern ecologists will do to get us to like, all right, computer, here's all the things we know. Help us reconstruct the full picture of this local food web, right?
Mhm.
What are the interactions and relationships between all of these organisms? This helps us to assess, to understand the complicated interactions of a food web, the things that we might not notice at first glance. This helps to figure out what all of those connections are. Into this analysis, the researchers included not only evidence of diets, but also body sizes of the different groups, potential evidence of group behavior versus solitary living, ontogenetic changes, so differences in adults versus young, because dinosaurs, as we've discussed a whole bunch of times, went through major changes over the course of their lives. So, like something like alligators, probably had a different role in their food chain as they developed over the course of their lives. The authors do make the point that there are some parts of this food web analysis that are more limited or generalized, particularly when it comes to things like plants and insects, which obviously there were tons of plants and insects, but the diversity of them isn't understood quite as well. So there are some areas of this food web that are a little less resolved, perhaps. Overall, their analysis identified over 12,000 unique connections between organisms in this habitat. They found some interesting notes regarding the biggest dinosaurs around. For example, this analysis indicates that the biggest predatory dinosaurs, your allosaurs and your torvosaurs, seem to most likely have had very broad diets.
Cool.
That they weren't necessarily special. They weren't eating like one specific type of thing, which would make them extremely influential predators
Yeah.
in the ecosystem because they're eating everything.
Yes.
And then on the other hand, their analysis found that the dinosaurs with the most influence, the most connections in the food web by far were sauropods.
Yeah.
The big, long-necked, long-tailed dinosaurs had way more trophic connections, so relationships via who's eating what, compared to other herbivorous dinosaurs. They were basically, it's like sauropods touch almost everyone else in the food web. This is probably related to their diversity, right? There were lots of species of them. Their abundance, right? They weren't rare in the landscape. There were tons of them. And they're huge. They're gigantic. They probably lived for a long time. So they were just these massive shapes on the landscape. And on top of that, the fossil evidence that we do have for sauropod lifestyles suggests that they didn't do very much parental care.
Yeah. Yep.
They were living more like sea turtles than alligators, right? They laid some nests and then probably just walked off, and the young hatched and went off and did their own thing, which means that there were lots of little sauropods running around in this ancient ecosystem.
Yeah.
And in fact, a lot of the headlines about this that have been written in the news are headlines that say things like Jurassic predators snacked on tons of baby sauropods.
Yep.
This makes sauropods at every level of their diversity and their age major ecosystem engineers, hugely important to the structure of their local ecosystem. This, like I said before, is not terribly surprising. You would expect that such an abundant and diverse group of such giant animals would be influential. This is a fun mathematical model that says, yeah, here's how influential they seem to have been. Also, the fact that sauropods were such a big deal in late Jurassic North American ecosystems does raise the question of what happens when you remove sauropods from ecosystems. And there is a whole section of the paper where they talk about comparing late Jurassic North America with late Cretaceous North America. Because in the late Cretaceous of North America, sauropods are pretty much absent. They were mostly southern species by that point. And we see some other notable differences between these time period ecosystems. In the Jurassic, you have all of these different predatory dinosaurs of large and medium sizes. But in the Cretaceous, you have much fewer of those.
Yeah.
For example, like the Hell Creek Formation, episode 127, it's T-Rex.
Yep.
And that's like you have a very limited amount of giant predators and a very limited amount of middle-sized predators. And big predators like T-Rex have a bunch of specialized hunting adaptations that we don't see in allosaurs and torvosaurs. Right? T-Rex has that specialized bite force, signs of enhanced vision and smell, more running adapted features in the legs. And we don't see that in late Jurassic theropods. So not only has the diversity of predators shifted, but the style of predator is different. And this may be related to the fact that late Cretaceous North America was not rich in sauropods, so the prey of these big theropods were hadrosaurs, horned dinosaurs like Triceratops, pachycephalosaurs, ankylosaurs, all of which are either good at running, covered in armor and spikes, or excellent parents.
Yep.
So you didn't have a smorgasbord of several species of soon-to-be giant baby dinosaurs.
Yeah. Unattended youths.
Yes, absolutely. So this is, again, a sort of statistical support for this idea that has been hypothesized that one of the major differences between the fundamental shape of dinosaur ecosystems between the Jurassic and the Cretaceous was the presence or absence of this one group of dinosaurs.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, these are a lot of observations that make a ton of intuitive sense and are what we would kind of expect. We've noted before that Africa's ecosystem of having multiple large-bodied predators is unusual. Like you don't typically see that in most environments. There's like one, maybe two big-bodied land predators.
Yeah, like here in modern North America, we've got two.
Yep.
Right? We've got pumas and gray wolves, and that's about all of our big predators.
Yeah, so like it's not common that you get to have a confluence of predators unless you have a smorgasbord of prey. And in Africa, it's the many herds of zebra and wildebeest and antelope and all of those that supply these predators. It's very cool that we can see a similar pattern with dinosaurs, that it seems like, the Jurassic was much more like Africa in that you were able to supply more generalized predators and a diversity of predators because you had just so many prey items that were big enough to feed them and behaviorally accessible, I guess is a way to say it.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I like so much about the implications of this interpretation is because T-Rex, we talk about T-Rex as, one of the most specialized and incredible hunting machines in Earth history. And that's not just hype. T-Rex does have a lot of really impressive specialized adaptations for taking down prey and for chomping on bones and stuff. And the implication of this interpretation is that T-Rex was like that because it had to be.
Yeah. Yep.
Like Allosaurus could get away with just eating baby sauropods left and right. Yeah. But if T-Rex wanted to have a meal, it either had to chase down a hadrosaur, fight an ankylosaur, or try to steal a baby triceratops from its parents.
Yes.
It was hard to get a meal in the Hell Creek Formation.
Which also is so fun to kind of recontextualize sauropods a bit, because when we think of sauropods, we think of adult sauropods, because that's what's famous and that's what fossilizes. We don't get a lot of small-bodied sauropods because they don't fossilize as well. And I think because of that, it's very easy to think of them just like elephants, that they're these massive herbivores. They were probably knocking over trees and reshaping the ecosystem, and they probably were doing that. But elephants are very tight family groups.
Yes. And elephants also have one baby at a time.
One baby at a time.
So even if elephants were just kicking their babies out of the nest, dude, there's only one baby elephant.
Yes.
But a sauropod is laying a nest of dozens.
Yeah.
And then not raising them.
Yep.
So there's just hordes of baby sauropods running around.
And that's the part that to me is so like intriguing and very funny to picture, that like these giant majestic animals were probably just that when they were grown, but before that it was probably just a mundane of like, yep, there's another juvenile sauropod wandering around.
Yeah.
Just yep, there goes another one. Oh, that one's actually getting to be notable size. Okay, that one's made it long enough. But mostly it's just like, oh yep, they're getting into the garden, and like they would just be a complete, you wouldn't even pay attention to them if you lived back then, because they were probably just like, yeah, no, it's a baby sauropod. Yes, it is massive compared to me, but it's not even halfway to full grown. So,
Yes. Well, it's like when you live in a place when black bears show up.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, whatever. But when a grizzly shows up,
yes.
Well, all right, everybody go inside.
Yeah.
Well, and this harkens back to one of my favorite little fun reminders of how nature works, which is there is no such thing as an animal with no predators.
Yep.
Or at least there's no such thing as a species with no predators.
Yes.
An individual, fully grown male elephant, or any or female elephant even, is that you basically don't have to worry about any predators on the landscape as long as you're
the
healthy.
juggernaut.
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing will stop you. But you didn't start that way. And sauropods especially probably spent most of their lives not like that.
Yeah.
And so, just this idea of what it meant to be a dinosaur ecosystem engineer and how it's different from our modern giant herbivores in these fundamental ways that change the entire ecosystem.
Yeah.
That's the fact that elephants give live birth means that their impact on the ecosystem is radically different than sauropods, and that's fascinating.
When we had a news a little bit ago talking about that, if you treat the growth stages as functional species, it means that these ecosystems were more diverse than mammal species are as far as ecological roles go, that baby sauropods were probably functioning as effectively a different kind of animal.
Yeah. Always fascinating to discuss how our understanding of dinosaurs changes with new evidence. And hey, what do you say? We keep discussing that for the next hour and a half or so. Let's take a short break, and then after that, we will be joined by special guest, super very special guest, Riley Black, to talk about the Dinosaur Renaissance, how we went from being wrong about dinosaurs in the early 1900s to being less wrong about dinosaurs in the modern day. Hello, Riley.
Hello, it's a joy to be back.
Thank you so much for joining us again. We are thrilled to have you here. As longtime listeners of the podcast will know, we are big fans. Your name actually comes up a bunch on the podcast because our news section, we always like to cite a popular article, and not infrequently those articles have your name in the byline.
Oh, you keep writing long enough, and you start doing it to yourself almost. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to research something. It's like, I remember this discovery, and the first search result something I wrote 10 years ago or something like that.
I have been in that position.
Yes.
Today, you are here to join us for the first time for a full episode, which we're very excited about, to talk about the Dinosaur Renaissance, which we will get to in a moment. But before that, if you would please tell our listeners who may be unfamiliar who you are.
Certainly. So I'm the author of about a dozen different books on paleontology, including the latest ones being When the Earth Was Green and The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, which both wound up as bestsellers. I'm a regular contributor to National Geographic, Smithsonian, Slate. I've written for basically pick a science publication. I've probably had a byline in it at some point, been on Nova a few times. And when I'm not doing all that stuff, I've frequently gone out into the field with university museum crews to help with the field work, find new fossil sites. Found a couple cool things over the years. So my career really is paleontology and enthusing about it in all these different
Mhm.
formats.
Excellent. Listeners may remember that the last time you were on the podcast was a number of months ago to talk about your new book, When the Earth Was Green, which is fantastic and everybody should go read it. And listeners may also be familiar, because I know I've talked about it, that Riley is one of the main influences that encouraged me to get into science communication. And
Mhm.
so it's a joy. It's an absolute joy to have you on.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, I love when things are reciprocal like that. Like that's how I got started, was other people inspiring me and kind of ushering me into this world. So I'm glad that I can do the same and we can all nerd out about this stuff together.
Yes.
Yay.
And every now and then we'll get emails and messages from listeners who are asking us about how to get into
Mhm.
science communication. And it's a constant
Yes.
chain of giving rise to generations that will hopefully do even better than we're doing.
Someone's got to talk about these fossils and stuff.
Yes.
Mhm.
Well, let's start talking about these fossils and stuff. We're going to go into a whole bunch of detail, but if you could please just briefly overview what is the dinosaur renaissance?
So the dinosaur renaissance, for the most part, when we use that term specifically, really talking about the 1970s and the 1980s in dinosaur paleontology. We'll get into whether we're still within the dinosaur renaissance or not, but specifically when somebody invokes that term. As far as I can recall, it was coined by Bob Bacher during that time period, which is always interesting when you get the name of, a momentous moment in the middle of it. A little presumptuous, but it worked out. And it was this time period when dinosaurs fundamentally changed. There was a 20th century image of what a dinosaur is. It was, the traditional tail dragging, not particularly smart, cold blooded, slow moving, lives in a swamp kind of imagery. If you've seen Fantasia, you basically got it. And then all of a sudden, we have warm blooded dinosaurs and dinosaurs with feathers on them and maybe being related to birds and they're living in social groups and maybe there's this mass extinction. So it was this time period, like it's probably as close to a paradigm shift as I can think of in the history of science. They're relatively rare. And this really is one of those moments where all these threads catalyze and kind of gave us our modern image of what dinosaurs are.
Yeah, it's kind of the bridge from Godzilla to Jurassic Park.
I love that you picked those movies because that's exactly it. I mean, that's why I was so excited to see Jurassic Park when I was 10, because that was the first time that we got to see like the new dinosaurs on
Yeah.
screen. Prior to that, if you were, a dino fan in that time period, everything was like Ray Harryhausen stop motion stuff, which was gorgeous, beautiful, wonderful in so many ways. But the way the imagery changed was just so fundamental.
Hmm.
It's interesting, like, noting when it happened, and that's something I didn't appreciate until I was much older, how recent the Renaissance was. Because growing up, I came in after most of it, so all of the new was in all of my books. And
Yes.
so it wasn't until later that I was like, oh, when you meant we used to think, you meant like shortly before I was born used to
Right.
think. I, as a kid, I just assumed, like, yeah, back in the dark ages, we used to think that they were slow, and now we know some of them are fast. And it's like, oh no, that was a very recent turnaround.
It's kind of fun talking to folks now about dinosaurs and
Mhm.
how we depict them because, like you said, oftentimes like I have to introduce the incorrect image to be like, this is what we used to think. A lot of people's like, well, that they were
Hmm.
already feathered when I was a kid and growing up.
Yeah.
It's just it moves that quickly. But during that time period, it also went along with the sense of dinomania and that, all
Hmm.
this new discovery and controversy and debate. This would often be like, cover stories on Time and National Geographic. New York Times kept track
Hmm.
of, the whole, impact debate over the KPG extinction during this time period. It really was that everybody all of a sudden, they already knew dinosaurs. They had some image of what they were like, but all of a sudden, the sense of scientific controversy and discovery and telling people that their dinosaurs are wrong really caught on. And it was wild being a kid at the time. I remember in my elementary school library, there would be books by Edwin Colbert, dinosaur paleontologist from the 20th century that we'll talk a bit about, during this discussion. And it would be the old image with the old phylogenetic trees and everything else. And then when I'd see a documentary, I'd go to a museum or a traveling exhibit or whatever, the dinosaurs would be fundamentally different. So I feel like for someone living through it, for myself, it really was getting both at the same time. It was like this history lesson where you had to keep in mind like what we used to think and what we think now and why that is.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, since this is a discussion about this time period that was a fundamental change, I think in order to really understand the significance of the change, we have to talk about what came before that.
Yes.
So before we get to the Renaissance itself, let's talk about the road to the Renaissance. Let's go all the way back. So paleontology as a science, as we understand it, really kind of kicks off in the 1800s. So can you give us just a general of, we did a Bone Wars episode 58. We've touched on this period before, but let's start with just an overview of what was the vision of dinosaurs back in that early century or so, and what were the seeds of the dinosaur renaissance that were being planted back then?
I mean, it's great to go back to this, right? Because dinosaurs have always been changing, even before they had a name. I think it's worth recognizing that, we've known about dinosaurs since, for centuries, really, before we had a concept of what a dinosaur is, especially indigenous peoples in North America and elsewhere, like found dinosaur fossils, tracks and bones, and had their own interpretations and explanations for what these are, recognizing them as animals from a long time ago. Paleontology, and our concept of what a dinosaur is, and sort of the realm in which you speak about dinosaurs now, that really came about in the early 19th century. I mean, the fact is that even the idea of extinction, that there were animals that used to live a long time ago that are not around anymore, was really only articulated and started to be broadly accepted in 1799. This is all relatively recent stuff. The word dinosaur itself doesn't get coined until 1842. Just prior to that, with the description of what we now recognize as dinosaurs like Megalosaurus and Iguanodon, our first ones to get, scientific names, they were thought to really just be big lizards. They were found these fragmentary pieces in England. They are clearly reptilian. You just find the closest thing. Megalosaurus was thought to be kind of crocodile-like. Iguanodon was supposed to be like a big rhinoceros iguana or something like that, maybe 100 feet long based upon the size comparisons. And as better and better fossils start to become found, these things come together. We have Richard Owen, who is one of the most complicated and probably loathsome characters in the history of paleontology, who nonetheless will forever be tied to these animals. And when he coined the word dinosaur for just three of them, it was Megalosaurus, Iguanodon, Hylaeosaurus. Came out with a report in 1841 and didn't do the name until the print edition a year later. They were united by certain features, but he could tell immediately that they, held their legs straight beneath their bodies and had these features that made them seem to be a bit more active, in some ways more mammal-like than what a lot of people supposed. If you see the Crystal Palace dinosaurs today, which are still standing in London, that's Owen's image that Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, the artist, created, shortly after the announcement of the word dinosaur. And they seem very rhinoceros-like. They seem very mammal-like. Owen, he had evolutionary ideas that had nothing to do with natural selection, but he still had thoughts about sort of the development of life and progress and how these things go. And to him, dinosaurs were animals that were not lizards, but they were trying to imitate mammals. We're kind of going along on that scale. And then when we get the development of paleontology, you have, sort of Europe as this center of academic paleontology. You mentioned the Bone Wars, both Cope and Marsh, they get trained in Europe. They come back to the United States on the East Coast where there are fossils. Things are slightly more complete and a little bit different. And because of manifest destiny in the U.S. settling, colonizing the western part of the continent, especially through railway lines, we have people, getting to these big exposed areas with lots and lots of fossils, and we start to see complete dinosaurs for the first time. And that's when you have the puzzle box as well as the pieces, and you really get a sense of this animal. And we have things like Triceratops and Ceratosaurus that clearly these are animals that are unlike any mammal or reptile. They're their own group of really weird creatures.
Yeah.
And that's when we start to get like, how do we reconstruct and restore them? So, just through that time period, it was just so much, every decade or so, there was some update, small or large, through the 19th century of what dinosaurs were supposed to be like.
It's fascinating to think back on. You were talking about the experience of being a kid during this renaissance going on now, and just imagining being a dinosaur kid in like the mid to late 1800s, and you start with these fragments and these ideas of how might this go together, and it's so weird and bizarre, and then you get complete skeletons and they're even weirder.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, it's not a big lizard and it's not a rhinoceros. It is not comparable directly to anything we have today.
Well, and what a surreal realization. The idea of there were animals, not just extinct versions of animals that we have, extinct things we do not have any example of. And
Mm-hmm.
like that had to be just a very world shattering realization of like, oh yeah, no, there are things that have gone extinct that we don't have any example to compare to now. Not even
Yeah.
something like a naked woolly mammoth with elephants. It just wholly different.
Entirely. And I'm glad that you brought up being a dinosaur kid back then. There's actually, because there's always the popular perception of these animals and the academic one, right? And how
Mm-hmm.
those translate and how dinosaurs kind of go back and forth between those realms. Not to say all kids felt this way, but there's a great cartoon from the satire magazine in England called Punch that shows, someone's guardian, rich kid, silver spoon kid, the guardian guy taking him through the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, and the kids just bawling their eyes out. And the caption, something like, Master Tommy does not like enjoy having his mind improved. And I love that since the very beginning, we've always like, are dinosaurs appropriate for children? We associate children in the dinosaur phase and all this stuff and the love of these creatures. They're these big monstrous snaggletooth things. Like, are we sure that we want to be like taking our kids right up to them? And that's a whole other, kettle of fish. But I love that it's always been there. And between those two realms, so we have this public image that are more or less prehistoric monsters. The newspaper coverage and a lot of the books and stuff, you'd have entire books put out, just titled things like prehistoric monsters. But paleontology is a science that was born of geology and comparative anatomy married together. And the key comparative anatomy is, of course, comparison. So when you had, Cuvier in France and Owen in England and Cope and Marsh and their associates Leidy in the United States, they were comparing these dinosaur fossils to other living things, trying to figure out what they were. And it's so bizarre to me that at the end of the 19th century, as we get into the late 1800s, we have Marsh saying, okay, these toothed birds that we're finding in the West are very dinosaur-like, and they seem to bridge this gap. We have Archaeopteryx as the earliest bird that was found, not long after On the Origin of Species was published. And this is a bird that, it has teeth, it has claws, it has a long tail. It has these reptilian features. We're starting to see these transitional forms and these resemblances. It's like birds and reptiles have something to do with each other. Dinosaurs seem to be like they must have been very active animals. Maybe they were warm-blooded. Maybe they were more bird-like in a sense, not how we think of them now, but there's something there that, that they're not just like big lizards. We can't fit them into that mold. The fact that, Cope commissioned Charles R. Knight as one of his early pieces, the famous Leaping Laelaps painting.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes
Mm-hmm.
we forget we're so used to seeing it as a singular piece, we forget its context from the history of science, and that was a really not just a bold decision for its time, but it was based upon what the image of dinosaurs was becoming. It wasn't just all tail dragging living in a swamp. These were envisioned as very active, behaviorally dynamic animals. And that's part of the mystery that I'm sure we'll get into in a moment, is just like you have all these paleontologists that are edging up to this idea that maybe dinosaurs are more like birds. Maybe they're more active. Maybe they're more behaviorally complex than we ever would have expected. And then it entirely fizzles out.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really it really is striking to go back and read some of these older writings by people like Marsh, who were like, "Hey, these dinosaurs are more bird-like than we might have expected," and or vice versa, or Owen saying these were active, they're holding their legs underneath their body, they're shaped kind of like mammals. To look at that artwork and really have to go, this is 100 years before I learned that. Like, this is 100 years before that became the popular image. They were starting to put that together. So the next question, I guess, is what were they missing? Why didn't the dinosaur renaissance happen a century earlier?
That's a big question, right? Why did this next generation of paleontologists and researchers not pick this up and continue with it? I have a couple of ideas, or at least things that probably influenced this imagery shift, right? In that, you have the death of Cope Marsh, you have the death of a lot of these people who had these early kind of very, active dinosaur ideas ended up passing away by the end of the century. And in many cases, they were just so cantankerous and mean and overworking people around them and being a pain in the butt that I think a lot of people just, in a sense, did not necessarily want to pick up their academic program and continue along these same lines of thought. This is also the era of museum building. This is where we have the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, the what becomes the Field Museum in Chicago, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh. You have these very storied, marble hall kind of lots of, philanthropists showing, the good that their money is going to do for the common man by educating him kind of institutions being built. And they know that dinosaurs get butts in the seats. They know that this is going to attract crowds and impress people because they are big, impressive animals, and they're brand new. Nothing like them has ever been seen before. It still cracks me up to this day that when Tyrannosaurus Rex was being named well over 100 years ago, the first parts of it to go on exhibit were just the hips and the legs next to that of an ostrich. And already, like, the New York Times is calling it the prize fighter of antiquity. And it's just a pair of legs in the hall before people even see the rest of it. But when we think about what did dinosaurs mean to researchers and paleontologists in the broader sense, we think about them in the evolutionary sense, since we have the Darwin-Wallace, theory of evolution by natural selection that shows up in the mid-19th century, it wasn't immediately accepted. People, I think, often forget this, that, it wasn't as if like Darwin-Wallace had this idea, and other people had similar ideas before him, but they articulated it certainly in the 1850s. It wasn't that people were like, it makes so much sense. Perfect. There are people like, okay, like evolution must have happened. That's undeniable. The fossil record and other clues leave us no option but to accept evolution. But maybe it happened a different way. There was a resurgence of Lamarckian ideas. There was a surge of ideas about sort of internal urges. What if there are kind of drives, like species have a birth, a life, and a death, just the same way that individuals do, or groups of organisms. So paleontologists were looking at the fossil record and just seeing how long dinosaurs were around, how big they got, how strange they seemed. Things like Stegosaurus, the plates on its back and spikes on its tail, or things like Brachiosaurus, absolute gigantic animal. They couldn't even conceive how this thing was moving around. And they kind of took this view that's like, this is just so bizarre. We can't, it doesn't seem to make sense. They seem to kind of come out of nowhere, are around for a very long time, and disappear. How does that make sense with evolution by natural selection? So if you read evolution textbooks and stuff, many by dinosaur paleontologists from the 1920s and the early 20th century, a lot of them are basically like, these are just big weirdos. No one knows why they're around so long. They had some kind of glandular deficiency or something wrong with them, that they got too big and they got too weird and they couldn't adapt and they went extinct. And this seemed to go with a lot of social ideas at the time about sort of seeing these big oil or train or steel or whatever companies that would get really, really big, and they kind of seem to be these titans on the landscape, and then they'd fold and disappear. And that, I feel like that social aspect informed a little bit of this as well. But really, it's like dinosaurs were interesting. They were cool. They got people to visit museums, but academics could not make sense of them in evolutionary context. If you wanted to study evolution, you're a paleontologist, you studied fossil mammals. They were way more familiar. They were more recent. They were way more abundant. Most of those evolutionary trees and stuff don't make sense now based upon what we know. But at the time, it's you have the classic evolution of the horse, or the evolution of camels, or all the phylogenetic trees of all the different fossil elephants and stuff, because we had so many. That was where anybody who wanted to be a theorist, anyone who wanted to out Darwin basically spent their time. And this image, just to one final beat on it that I felt was super important, is that researchers didn't know modern reptiles very well either. So this image of a big, weird, not very smart, tail dragging, swamp bound dinosaur, because they're supposed to be good reptiles. Well, why did anyone think that's what being a good reptile is. We
Right.
know that reptiles can be incredibly smart and learn a great deal and behaviorally adaptive. I mean, the fact is that, like American alligators, which people have known about for centuries, thousands of years, can be observed easily within their range, have great parental care. That was not recognized until the middle of the 20th century. The thing that was so obvious that's involves emotion and intelligence and behavioral complexity wasn't even recognized. So I think it was a lot of ignorance about modern reptiles, as well as kind of just, yeah, I don't know why paleontology decided to kind of diss dinosaurs for a good 70 years or so, but apparently that's what happened.
I think it's a
Yeah.
really interesting and important note to make that one of the major things that kind of held back paleontology from understanding these subjects was the lack of development in other areas of science.
Hmm.
That while the Bone Wars is going on, people are still arguing about Darwin and whether or
Yeah.
not this natural selection thing is real. And this is 100 years before plate tectonics was recognized. And so it really does put into context that, yeah, you kind of can't understand dinosaurs if biology and geology are still not fledged. If those fields are still on their way, you're never going to get these important dinosaur conclusions.
Well, and as like you point out, if they are also burdened by a major mammal bias,
Mm-hmm. What's that like?
then of course dinosaurs don't make sense to you because you're trying to make them make sense from a mammal or your poor view of a reptile, and that's not going to work. Like your example with alligators, we didn't start like training them verbally until the last couple of decades, even though we've been keeping alligators and crocodiles in zoos for well beyond that, and just no one had thought that they could be smart enough.
Yeah, this is a recurring theme when you look at the history of science, that there are certain topics in science that just it seems like everyone just kind of agreed to not care about it for a long time
Mm-hmm.
until somebody later steps up and is like, "Hey, medical science has been focusing on literally 50% of medical patients. Maybe we change that."
Yeah, it's as you mentioned, so much of this has to do with the context of the history of science, and that when we have the 19th century in paleontology studies, so many of the people who are writing these papers and studying these fossils, they come from some kind of wealth, usually where they can afford to make this their
Mm-hmm.
career, and they're usually some kind of polymath that they're interested in all these different branches of science, doing a whole bunch of comparisons, and they write papers on a whole broad range of subjects. And then in the 20th century, you start to get more specialization, that you have paleontologists who are not only this kind of rich class where they can just obsess over fossils all day, but they're also running museums and having administrative duties. We have the development of sort of science museums and universities and things like that in a much more structured kind of way. And then it becomes like, well, what is everybody individually interested in? What can they get support for? And who is allowed to
Mm-hmm.
actually do the science? And all these things play into it as well. It's so complex when you get all the way down through it. And it seemed like, especially in this era where, between 1859 and the 1940s, where we have the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory, and everyone goes like, nope, natural selection really is like the core of it, and we'll work from there. But during those many, many decades, everybody agreed that evolution must be happening somehow, but nobody could agree on how to do it. So if you wanted to make a name for yourself, you were going to crack this nut. You were going to figure out how this worked. And
Yeah.
dinosaurs, I think, for the most part, were just not a route that anybody could see to do that. They seem to be disconnected from the rest of
Yeah.
the history of life.
So this leads us into this early 1900s period where this is an era that is sometimes called the dinosaur doldrums, which is kind of if you make a time scale of paleontology history, you've got the Bone Wars, which is dramatic and exciting, and you've got the Dinosaur Renaissance, which is dramatic and exciting, and then you have this sort of boring billion equivalent in the middle where dinosaurs kind of take a back seat. And a lot of what you've been saying, sort of leading into this, what beyond what we've already said, what's the deal in this like first half of the 1900s, this dinosaur doldrums period?
It's so strange. I think one of the most important things to remember about this is like it's not scientifically or theoretically consistent. I think we expect, the narrative to be relatively easy, that, we have this early burst of inspiration about paleontology and we think that these are, active and live and interesting animals, and then they become these tail draggers. But the fact is that, there were discoveries being made like Ornitholestes, the small coelurosaur from the Morrison Formation. If you think of kind of, medium-sized dog, kind of about that stature. And its name means bird robber. And if you look at the early illustrations of this animal, it's leaping in the air after things like Archaeopteryx. It seemed obvious that this probably was a very active animal that was not doing the same things as, a big T-Rex, or, certainly not a Triceratops or a Stegosaurus or something like that. The ostrich mimic dinosaurs, things like Struthiomimus and Ornithomimus, things that basically had the ostrich body plan down so far that even as we make new discoveries, they become more and more ostrich and emu like, which still cracks me up, this case of convergence. It's just so incredible where you look at them and it's obvious that they must be moving in this bird-like way, that they are not lizard-like, they're much more bird-like. And people would kind of play with this idea, but then set aside, no, that can't possibly be true. I mentioned Edwin Colbert earlier on, this major figure in 20th century dinosaur paleontology, and worked for many years at the American Museum of Natural History, having access to many of these very storied and complete skeletons, and kind of did a lot of training for the generation of paleontologists that come up in the Dinosaur Renaissance later. But even he, if you read his popular audience books, he would talk about these small theropods in particular and say, like, they seem like they must be active. Yes, the hadrosaurs and ceratopsids and all the horned dinosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs, anything big must have been this weird reptile thing. We don't really know how it works. But the little ones, like, there was something about them that paleontologists kept kind of going back to and shying away from it. And I'm not entirely sure what that was about, what the fear was there about kind of reviving some of these early ideas that they must have encountered. They must have run into some of these things and thought about them.
Yeah,
But
that's
even
interesting.
after that early kind of time period in the 1920s and stuff like that, there weren't that many vertebrate paleontologists professionally. And there were so many discoveries being made at such a rate that dinosaurs, I imagine, in some ways, like, it might have seemed like they were done, like they were kind of well understood for what they were. In a way, there wasn't any big revolutionary idea that was going to come out of them. And paleontology was so qualitative at the time. It really was. You find a new species, you person to name it, you do the description, you figure out where it fits in the family tree, what that means for evolutionary processes. But part of what we'll get into when we talk about the Renaissance is like kind of the difference of computer powered paleontology and a very descriptive paleontology that came before, where it was very difficult to really say anything with certainty. It really was, you looked at an animal and you made your best guess about how that thing was living.
Yeah, there was no math in it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I had the thought and wondered if some of the lag, like the fact that they seem to keep approaching and then shying away from, how much of that could be driven by social pressure of I'm coming to a conclusion, but I'm worried that that's going to be an unpopular conclusion. Like that's going to be an unpopular thing to say flat out. So I'm just going to suggest it here and there, and then I'm going to step away from it again because I don't want to have the arguments, because I'm not yet like fully convinced, or I don't yet have solid evidence. So I'm just going to suggest and then move away from again.
I like that because I think it brings up an important point, in that we're talking about these early ideas that we now know were correct. But even then, even the idea of warm-blooded dinosaurs in the late 19th century, or amongst paleontologists during the 20th century who played around with it, there was no more evidence for that than there was for cold-blooded dinosaurs. There was no more evidence for cold-blooded dinosaurs than there was the other way around. So you kind of have an orthodoxy, you kind of have a consensus view. But even if you have the intuition and the gut feeling that they're doing something different, as you said, the question is going to be like, well, how do you justify that? What's your research for changing what we've always assumed?
Right.
And there wasn't anything really definitive yet. So even though that there weren't that many paleontologists, I can only imagine like the outrage would have been relatively minor. It might have been a way like wrangling with the fact that it primarily at the time was a very descriptive science. And if you were going to rock the boat a bit on the image of what these animals were like, there would probably be a lot more pressure to justify that even though there wasn't necessarily any great evidence to assume the way that they were restoring them. It was, everybody kind of had their, this is a whole other conversation, really, but dinosaurs from the very beginning have been these animals that we project so much onto about what we think about the past, how we feel. From the very beginning, some of the earliest paleo art that exists is very much informed by the idea of, like violent catastrophe and revolution, and the idea of, dramatic change happening in these moments because of the American and French revolutions and other political things going on around where paleontology as a science was centered. And I think that has a lot to do with this. And as we're talking about sort of this back and forth between culture and science, I think it's important to know, as much as I love Stephen Jay Gould, I think he's wrong about 20th century image of dinosaurs, in that in one of his essays on Dinomania, he mentions, being a kid and being called fossil face and being made fun of for being into fossils. And I'm very sorry that he was bullied in that way. That's terrible. At the same time, if you look at the media landscape, we had things through the 20th century like the Flintstones, like the establishment of Dinosaur National Monument and lots of roadside dinosaurs, things like people flocking to Petrified Forest National Park. I think there's always been a public sort of interest and acknowledgement of dinosaurs as just something big, weird, interesting, what have you. Some of the earliest films, from the moment film was more or less invented, dinosaurs were almost right there from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So I feel like there are these two worlds that inform each other, where, if the public had been more interested in fossil mammals, as the paleontologists were, maybe we wouldn't be here talking about dinosaurs right now. Maybe we'd be talking about brontotheres or something like that as the big cool animals that all ideas are changed about. But I think in some way the public fascination with dinosaurs is what allowed the Renaissance to happen, because the public kept dinosaurs relevant. They kept them interesting in a way, even if paleontologists weren't on the same page.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to bring up the cultural aspect, because that also makes me think back to that idea of the social pressure, that it can be easy to underestimate the power of popular depictions of these animals. And they were being depicted in museum displays in a certain way, and they were showing up on screen. And it wasn't, I think it's easy to think of old school dinosaur movies as these like schlocky, silly sort of things. And a lot of them were that. But it was also like King Kong and The Lost World and some of the biggest and most popular movies around were all adhering to this general concept of what dinosaurs were like and how they looked. And even though those are not scientific in their depiction, that still puts that idea out there, that popularizes this depiction of these animals. Riley, you were mentioning earlier, you were listing some of the dinosaurs that were discovered, that could have been clues to these changes early in the 1900s. And the one that I kept thinking of while you were talking about it is Velociraptor was described in the 1920s. This animal that would decades, half a century later, would become the poster child, the poster dinosaur for the image of dinosaurs being bird-like, spent 70 years sort of overshadowed by these much more common depictions of these animals in movies and in museums. And that really does sort of set a precedent. And the other thing I did want to bring us back to is, you mentioned earlier that you hinted to the fact that not only were there not a lot of paleontologists studying dinosaurs, but a lot of them were huge jerks.
Yes.
We did an episode about Richard Owen, episode 184. We did an episode about Cope, episode 211. We have alluded to ominous figures like Henry Fairfield Osborn, where there are these stories back in the day of people in positions of influence pressuring others in ways that forced them to sort of abandon their trajectory in that science. Or, Cope and Marsh are famously said to have basically pushed Lady out of dinosaur paleontology because he got tired of dealing with these two colossal jerks. And I think that probably also didn't help that sort of stagnation of the field. Is it was a limited number of people, and it was also some people with kind of an iron grip on the field, as it were.
Entirely. Yeah. And working ideas into the science, like, you mentioned Henry Fairfield Osborn, who, was a huge eugenicist. He was a white
Mhm.
supremacist who, was involved in programs like awarding sort of the most genetically pure families, like that the organization that he, was associated with, like, could find. And that informed his ideas of like aristogenesis, this idea of aristogenes, which you couldn't really say what they were, but it was some kind of internal force or drive to, cause things to become better and better over time, befitting what he viewed as progress. And I'd like to think in many ways it's gotten better, but yeah, paleontology throughout its history, even today, has a lot of big jerks in it who have pushed
Mhm.
people and bullied people and otherwise driven people out of the field now of their studies, and especially in decades past where it was such a small discipline. I haven't been to it, but I've often heard it said, like, the first SVP meeting, the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, it's like a dozen people in front of a chalkboard. The dinosaur session used to be just like one session on one day, and now they just had the meeting in England last week. There are multiple dinosaur sessions, every single
Yeah,
day, and so the
it's
field is
half the
fundamentally
meeting.
different, yes, than what it was. But certainly the personalities involved and sort of who was allowed to do the science and what they had access to, where fossils were being found, the ways in which fossils were being found, how much of early paleontology really is a science of colonization, because so many of the fossils that were going to Owen in England or were going to Cope and Marsh from what's now the American West, they were basically fossils of conquest from these places that were being colonized. Someone found something interesting in the rocks because they had a mining interest or what have you, and would be sent back to England. That would become, this kind of prize jewel, not just only of science, but of empire. Look how far we reach
Mhm.
that we can understand the whole
Mhm.
planet. And all of these things are at play. This is why, like, if we were to write a book about the dinosaur renaissance, it would have, if it were to be complete, it'd be absolutely huge, because it's not just the science itself, but all these other sort of threads and interests about how the science gets done that influences what the image ends up becoming.
Well, and you mentioning like their personal views on things coming into it. That's something I was thinking about. This persistent view of, well, dinosaurs must have just been weird and messed up. It also lines up with the whole idea of that extinct things must have been a flawed experiment. That you're extinct because you weren't good enough to stick around, and that idea that perpetrated, the gone the way of the dinosaur for so long, also probably didn't help them think on them more dynamically, because they'd already concluded that, well, but they all died out, so how much more can there be to them?
Right.
Yes.
Well, and it's not surprising that really to look at figures like Cope and Osborne and to see these are people who thought that there was such a thing as better humans.
Yes.
It's not surprising that they also fell into this mindset that there were better animals.
Yeah.
That these are
Yes.
outdated, these weren't good enough for this, to live in this world anymore.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to the formulation of evolution by natural selection itself. That was part of Darwin's thesis in On the Origin of Species, was that
Mm-hmm.
the succeeding species will be better in some way. You can say better adapted, we might take that as neutral, but he really thought that the next iteration is going to be a better organism
Mm-hmm.
than what it's replacing. And there's a great book called Vanished, dealing with extinction as an idea that just came out this year. Doing a review for it for Smithsonian Magazine for their end of the year book list. But it's really about how we think of extinction as this fact of nature, and it is. All species go extinct eventually. There may be descendants of that species that go extinct that continue evolving. That's why we're here with everything else around us right now. But eventually, everything does. We know this. This is true. We've known this for since 1799 at least. But very quickly, the idea of extinction, because it was basically invented and bubbled up within a Western colonialist setting, it was immediately given these value judgments that if you're going extinct, you must be doing something wrong. You're not adaptable
Mm-hmm.
enough. You're not
Right.
flexible enough. You can't keep up with whatever conditions. You must be inferior in some way. And how quickly the idea of extinction has been projected onto people, to the point where anthropologists and archaeologists will say, well, this culture is entirely extinct, and there are people from that culture saying, no, we're here.
Mm-hmm.
But
Right.
it was assumed that the sort of steamroller of Western progress was going to subsume everything and cause extinctions of people and culture and languages. So extinction, by itself, when we talk about it, it's not just this scientific fact, but it's often been used as a value judgment and kind of bring it back into this realm of like, it's a thing that happens, but why does it happen? And let's unpack that. Is a relatively new thing in our considerations, and bringing it back to the dinosaurs, certainly through this, the dinosaur doldrums, which is often called the dilettante phase of dinosaur extinction theories, I think by Michael Benton. This is when no one really knew why the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. That's how every dinosaur thing ended. They went extinct. We don't know why. Maybe it was the climate, too hot or too cold, or this or that, or disease, or cataracts, or caterpillars eating all the green food, or whatever it was. It's like everybody could take a shot because there was no way to really test it. But it always seemed founded in the idea that dinosaurs were somehow incapable in some way, or had some core vulnerability that when the age of mammals began, even the fact that we refer to the Cenozoic so often that way, that it was like this overdue sort of comeuppance, that the underdogs finally won, and we don't have to have big weird reptiles around anymore.
Yeah, that it was like a usurping.
Yes.
Right. This is something I know you've written about, this language of, we talk about dinosaurs as being the dominant force, and then another force came along and overthrew the tyrants around at the time, which is a very, not only is that sort of a very modern and very culturally informed perspective, but doesn't do any favors for the history of paleontology being such a colonial science. Those are very colonial concepts.
Entirely. And I think that's what's missing, is we often discuss the time before the Dinosaur Renaissance and the Dinosaur Renaissance itself, is we often speak about it in terms of, well, scientists thought this and now they think that, as if it's like in a vacuum, as if you just kind of have this like room full of paleontologists who are just constantly thinking without any outside influence from anything whatsoever. But I think it's so important when we're talking about ideas of evolution and extinction, who survives, who thrives, like you just mentioned, this language of, are we choosing language involving dominance in the reign of the dinosaurs, or are we looking at it in a different way in terms of relationships, or something, how life diversifies together, especially in our present moment where diversity to some is a dirty word all of a sudden, how these things affect the way that we view nature and how it unfolds. And that was the beat through much of the 20th century, and I'm sure there's even more here, especially considering how the two world wars that happened early in the century, and ideas about dominance and global control, how that probably affected our views of dinosaurs. In fact, we have some glimmerings of how it did. During World War I, there was a pacifist group called the Anti-Preparedness League that had a Stegosaurus mascot named Jingo, because they're against jingoism, saying it was all armor plate and no brain. So basically, don't be like that. Don't be, a military pushover. Reject this war. So, dinosaurs have always been there for us to project our feelings onto. And I guess it's good that the non-avian ones are extinct, so they can't say like, yeah, you've been putting all this emotional gunk on me that absolutely isn't true.
I really
Somewhere
don't appreciate.
There's an isolated island in the middle of the ocean that no one can ever leave, where they're just stewing. How dare they say all these things about us? Okay. I would love to talk about the dinosaur doldrums for several more hours, because this is fascinating. But in the interest of getting closer to the topic of the episode,
yes,
we're in the early part of the 1900s. We're in this period of these ideas aren't catching on, right? It's Godzilla-shaped dinosaurs, sort of that whole 50-year period. As we start getting to the middle part of the century, right, the dinosaur renaissance is looming. It, as you said, the 70s and 80s. What are there signs around the middle part of the century that, like, the early steps? What's setting the stage for the dinosaur renaissance?
We don't know as much about this time period, I think, as we should. There aren't really a lot of great books about this. We have plenty of books about paleontology in the 19th century. We're starting to get more about the early 20th century, but the mid 20th century is a little bit difficult to interpret. I think, though, that what's preparing the dinosaur renaissance is, number one, a continued public fascination with them. The fact that you have, the Sinclair Oil Corporation, during this time window, picking a sauropod for their mascot, and sometimes sponsoring paleontological digs. I think Barnum Brown went on one near Shell, Wyoming, near where the Sinclair refineries and stuff are. And they had like Sinclair Dino Land at the New York World's Fair, and you can still see some of those sculpts around. If you go to Dinosaur National Monument on the Utah-Colorado border, you can see the Stegosaurus that was actually at that event that was created for it. So they were certainly still in public consciousness, and I keep thinking about the fact that this is supposed to be the time period where dinosaurs are dim-witted, not doing much interesting, and yet they're the stars of the Rite of Spring sequence in Fantasia. And they're fighting and they're moving through the ancient world kind of in some bird-like ways. I feel like even as the science of paleontology has gone, like, yeah, they're reptiles, they're probably more like crocodiles and lizards than anything else, that's what we're going to take as our cue. There was just this gut feeling that like they must have been active in some, they must have been in some form, the behavior must have been more interesting. If you get to the nitty gritty of the physiology or whatever else, like, of course, they're cold-blooded reptiles. If it's warm, they can move quickly, what have you. But it felt like there was always this little bit of like, yes, we're saying that they're reptilian cold-blooded, but we really have to like explain the heck out of that. We really have to show like, no, that this is how it was, because it just seems that's not right. They must be moving in these other ways. And I think this is important to point out. You sort of this kind of these ideas that were kind of on the edges of paleontology. You catch little glimmerings of it, and you'd see it in sort of art and culture around dinosaurs. Because in 1969, that's when we have John Ostrom describing Deinonychus, which is often taken as like, this is the central character. This is where the Dinosaur Renaissance begins, the discovery of that bone bed in Montana, and looking at this animal, the inspiration for the Jurassic Park raptors. That this is where ideas about social behavior and pack hunting come from, and this is an animal that had a claw held off the ground, because even though Velociraptor was described in the 20s, it was just the skull at the time, or at least that was the only reported part. Deinonychus, even though it was known from all these bits and pieces, they could kind of reconstruct most of the skeleton, and this was an animal that had a hyperextendable toe, basically with a huge claw on it, that had a tail with these long processes on each vertebra that turned it into something that was relatively stiff, that was clearly used for balance. It was kind of like if you found a sports car, even if you didn't know what a sports car was, it's like, that just kind of looks like it's supposed to be fast. I think is where it kind of started. And as much as the description of this dinosaur is credited as this is the real catalyst for the Dinosaur Renaissance, I think it was more a really important focal point for ideas that were long suspected, but were not really widely brought about. Along with, it's important to recognize that, 1969 is a little bit early for it, but during this era of paleontology, the latter 20th century, we have computers becoming smaller and smaller and more accessible, and that universities and eventually at home, you can have your own computer. You can start doing things like morphometrics. You can start taking points on a bone and making comparisons between different groups and saying, are these different sexes? Are these different species? Is this evolution? What have you? We're starting to get into a more quantified paleontology that's also entertaining things like mass extinctions, that life is not kind of just like this long kind of stew of progress bubbling up, but there are sometimes rapid disappearances and catastrophes, and the fossil record needs a lot of sort of recontextualizing and new studies. So there's a great book called The Paleobiological Revolution about this time period that doesn't so much deal with dinosaurs, but it seemed like academically that paleontology was getting this new breath of life into it, where it's not just curating these big weird things, but it's starting to think about them as animals, as living things that we can ask questions of and form hypotheses about and actually test.
Yeah. Well, on that note, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we will get into the details of the Dinosaur Renaissance proper, and then we can talk about that the whole rest of the episode. Can't wait. Everybody, stay tuned. Riley, this is. Do you ever get into a discussion and then you say, "Uh-oh, this could go all night"?
Yes. Yep.
This is fast. It's talking history and science is so fascinating.
It really is. I mean, I love it because I think it's a story that I've certainly heard plenty of times, that I think many people have heard plenty of times. It's I'll mention this when we get back into it, but it's funny to me that we started having books about the history of the dinosaur renaissance as it was unfolding, like Adrian
Right.
Desmond, people writing books about it. That I think kind of added to the historiography of like what must have happened and why. But there are so many unanswered questions. It's not the neat and clean story, I think, that's often presented, and that's
Uh,
part of what makes it so fascinating.
I love the discussion about how culture informs these scientific ideas. The thing that you said that has been in my brain since you said it that I didn't get a chance to bring up in the discussion, and maybe I'll bring it up later, is the comparison between views on dinosaurs and views on railroads, and the idea that this notion of dinosaurs as an outdated, big lumbering thing that wasn't fit for the present corresponds with the sort of all of that age of train. And you said it, and I was just putting these connections in my head between dinosaurs and trains,
Yeah.
and this notion that, like, yeah, there's a lot to find there to compare. That these are big, impressive things that kids flock to go to museums to see them. They hold these positions of cultural influence. They're extraordinarily common focuses of movies and fiction in both cases. And both of them are notoriously and humorously associated with autistic people.
Yeah.
That, like, trains and dinosaurs do have quite a lot in common now that you've drawn that
Yes,
comparison.
there's something here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now that's what I saw I don't remember who this was. Someone did a video essay about, like, I think it was like trains and superheroes, and just like the history of trains being important parts of superhero stories, and like why that is, and it got into like the cultural importance of trains and all this sort of stuff. And now this makes me want to either do it or watch an analysis of trains and dinosaurs, and just like the cultural connections over time.
The time is now. Yeah.
It might be. This is actually, listen, if I dwell on it enough, I might reach out to you and maybe we put something together about
Yes.
trains and dinosaurs.
I like it.
All right, let's get back into it. Let's talk about the Renaissance. So, Riley, as you mentioned shortly before the break, the sort of iconic start of the dinosaur Renaissance, the thing that is often pointed to, is work by a paleontologist named John Ostrom on a dinosaur, which happens to be my personal favorite dinosaur of all time, called Deinonychus. Please tell us about Ostrom and Deinonychus and this purported beginning step of the dinosaur Renaissance.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said this purported beginning, because I think it's worthwhile pointing out that the dinosaur renaissance as a term, was invented, shortly after this discovery. It really was within the time period itself. We're not looking back and labeling this because we think it's historically significant. It was basically, we're being told this is historically significant as it's unfolding. And there were books at the time, like Adrian Desmond did one called The Hot-Blooded Dinosaurs about this controversy in science. And I feel like it really framed what we think of this history, but kind of narrowed our view to the point that I think we're just now beginning to ask, like, did it really happen that way, or was that the impression, or what other factors were involved? I know historian of science Chris Manius has recently held a symposium about 2 years ago or so about the dinosaur renaissance and what questions we still have. So we're still building on this.
Yeah. Love Riley deconstructing the format of the episode outline during the episode discussion.
Yes.
That's incredible. Absolutely.
It was all a
'Cause
setup.
that's my notes. My notes says the dinosaur renaissance start with John Ostrom and Deinonychus. And these are excellent points. A little glimpse behind the scenes here that even my outline falls into this trap of saying this is how it got started.
Yeah.
I think, we have a date, we have a dinosaur, and one that we know is significant. And oddly enough, it was an animal that had been found previously. Barnum Brown, from what I understand, had recovered some partial fossils that were kind of put on a shelf somewhere at the AMNH. The working title was Daptosaurus, I think. So we almost had Daptosaurus instead of Deinonychus, the terrible claw. In any case, so we have John Ostrom, with his Yale crew, they're working out in Montana in the early Cretaceous sediments, Cloverleaf Formation, if I remember correctly, find this bone bed full of bits and pieces, and are able to reconstruct this animal that clearly, must have been relatively active. Deinonychus was not a big dinosaur, not quite as big as the, Velociraptor in the Jurassic Park and World films, but getting towards that size, bigger than turkey size, roughly person sized. And I think that's part of the relational quality to this as well. Like, this isn't a big dinosaur, it's an important dinosaur, it's relatively small and already within that range of what I think people are willing to accept as an active animal. If I think Ostrom or someone else had tried to forward, a much larger animal as being as active, I think it would have been much more of an uphill fight to get this accepted. And part of the reason why I think we often forget about this is that Ostrom was also very interested in the origin of birds. Did a whole bunch of research about Archaeopteryx, the first bird, visiting museum collections in Europe to, by then multiple specimens had been found. Actually, if I recall correctly, there was a fossil that was labeled as a pterosaur that turned out to be yet another Archaeopteryx that nobody had seen before. So as he's looking at Archaeopteryx, and he also has Deinonychus in mind, there's so many correspondences between these two theropods, even just beyond a passing, just at a glance resemblance in terms of like the way that their wrists work and seem to angle it. And Deinonychus in Ostrom's mind seems to become more and more bird-like. And this is also around the time that we have Ostrom has Robert Bacher as his graduate student, and where Ostrom, I think, the impression is very, very careful, very, very diligent, did great scientific work, even for hypotheses that ended up not turning out to work out. Was a very careful worker. And Bacher, as we all know, was going to bring the bombast and take these ideas and really coin the term dinosaur renaissance. Like, no, he's like, this is all changing now, and they're far more bird-like than we expected, really reviving a lot of these late 19th century ideas all over again. And while this is all happening, we also have things like the discovery of the development of paleontology within Canada. So not people going to southern Alberta and taking fossils out of it anymore, but more local development, where you have things like discoveries of vast Centrosaurus bone beds that have to do with like not only herding behavior, but taphonomy. How did this fossil bone bed form? What does it mean for the ancient world? And we have in Montana, the discovery of Maiasaura nesting grounds that later Jack Horn stuff like kind of took credit for, but local paleontologists and fossil dealers found it first. And again, this is parental care and social structure and baby dinosaurs, which were incredibly rare. And not just the eggs, but seeing what they were like as little things. And much like alligators, they're big-eyed and they're kind of cute. They don't look just like their parents. So within this realm of a much more computer focused and qualitative paleontology that has all this new technology and communication abilities paired with it, we also have this new generation of paleontologists coming up who are making these fantastic discoveries that haven't been seen before, reviving this interest in dinosaurs. And I think it's worth noting that this is during a time period where, I don't want to say most people because I don't have the numbers in front of me, but many, many people have a television in their house, that the news is not just coming from the daily paper or what have you, that discoveries are being announced almost as fast as they're being made in color on TV that you're going to watch with your TV dinner, for the 5 o'clock news in the evening, or dinosaur documentaries and things like that. So there was a direct line for science communicators and documentary makers to varying degrees of accuracy to look at all these conversations and all these discoveries and weave this narrative that this is important, something fundamentally is changing. And you have these big sort of the first big television personalities really in paleontology, bringing it directly to the public and being able to bridge that gap between the academic and that public fascination that's always been there. So it really was not just the discoveries themselves or paleontology being ready for it, but the way that communication and the way that we basically intake new scientific discoveries had fundamentally changed.
Yeah. Let's go. You've mentioned a lot of the different pieces that went into this changing vision of dinosaurs and their biology. Let's go piece by piece, and
Yes.
we'll zoom in on a few things. Let's start with the anatomical stuff, right? You mentioned Deinonychus. Obviously, there were these earlier dinosaurs. What was it in terms of anatomy at this time during this Renaissance that was leading paleontologists to draw this line between dinosaurs and birds, but with dinosaurs in a more active lifestyle.
In some ways, I think thinking about tails and tracks helped quite a bit. In that, for a long time, you see an illustration of a dinosaur during the 20th century. It's usually dragging its tail on the ground, often leaving a furrow behind it. When you looked at fossilized trackways, tail drags are incredibly rare. Most of the time, especially on these well-preserved tracks that are so finely formed that you can see the scales in the bottom of the foot, that you know this is not an under track, this is not a distortion, that was in the sediment beneath that track somewhere. You're seeing the track surface, you're seeing this animal take each step, and there's no tail drag there. And then when you look at the anatomy of the animal itself, I think the iguanodon that were found in the Bernissart, Belgium coal mine in the many decades before and were put on display, they had to break their tails to get them to stand in the position that they wanted them to during the initial reconstructions with that tail dragging posture. Because not only did they have vertebrae that kind of articulated in a certain way that suggested a stiff tail, there are ossified tendons that were crisscrossing a lot of those tailbones to keep them stiff. So even fossilized, even when you could piece apart all these bones, they're literally bending dinosaurs out of shape to get them to fit this idea. And I feel like when some of these possibilities came up and you looked at these tracks and you see no tail drags, you look at the tail of the animal, you can see that they're locking together in such a way that it must have been held off the ground. It was important as a counterbalance. It's like, well, that's the sign of an animal that needs to balance, that is probably moving in a way that needs to keep its balance because it's doing interesting behavioral things. So I feel like there are a number of those anatomical clues, as well as things like, I don't know if this is the correct term anymore, but I remember at the time, especially, the semilunate carpal, basically one of the wrist bones in Deinonychus, and its resemblance to birds. And this was kind of the swivel that, the hands had to face each other, but they could kind of swivel up and down. Basically, if you ever take a chicken wing or something like that, and you kind of pull it, it has that limited range of motion, side to side, but it can kind of go back and forth because it has to do with the flight stroke that was shared in common. It's like, well, what is this bird feature doing in this dinosaur? And even things that were not published at the time, because it's important to remember that the published record is not all there is. I wish that we had, transcripts or something to go to for the conversations that must have been happening at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meetings, that were happening in academic departments, that were happening in the field.
If only they had podcasts.
Yes, exactly. We're making the record. So even when I'm wrong some years later, they say like this is why, this is where the false narrative started.
Yes.
But I think these are the parts that these are some of the nowadays the things we take for granted as, oh, those old depictions, they were dragging their tails. And I know there were discussions around this time of brain size,
Yes.
Particularly with dinosaurs like Deinonychus, which we've talked a bunch on the podcast about how larger brains do not necessarily mean intelligence, but it is an interesting thing to look at a dinosaur and go, oh, it does have a bird-sized brain. And that does seem to be an indication that they are not these big, dumb, lumbering, all of these sort of like gotcha points that if you're our age and you grew up reading dinosaur books as a kid, these little factoids that you had in your head that you could be like, you're wrong about that. This is the time period where a lot of those are being discussed.
Right, and I think it's important that you brought up, the studies that Dale Russell and others did on, I guess it is Troodon again. I know it's gone back and forth over the years, but the small predatory dinosaur, Deinonychus-like, but it's kind of Deinonychus light. It's a more slender version of that sort of dinosaur, and that was key to this idea that you have this dinosaur with big eyes and binocular vision. The eyes face forward, and the brain case seems relatively big, and it seems relatively bird-like. And what does that mean? So it's especially these smaller animals that are doing a lot of heavy lifting and making the dinosaur bird connection and bringing up ideas about metabolism and physiology. And I think that's worth noting because given the history of what we talked about before, right, the era of museum building, that you want big, impressive dinosaurs. If you find a small one, maybe you'll collect it, might sit in a jacket for decades and not be prepared, because who's going to go to a museum to look at the small dinosaur except nerds like us? There's this discovery curve. I know Royal Ontario Museum paleontologist Dave Evan has done some talks and some work on this, looking at, which dinosaurs in a given formation tend to be discovered first. Like if you look at the Dinosaur Park formation, where so many of our 75 million year old friends from southern Alberta come from, you're going to find things that are Gorgosaurus size, Centrosaurus size, Parasaurolophus size, pretty big dinosaurs first because their bones were sturdy enough to get preserved more often. They're more attractive for museum displays, are often weirder, more interesting. And it's really only been since the Dinosaur Renaissance, just about, that, outside of chance discoveries, really, that we're looking at the smaller fauna that's always been there, but either people weren't looking for, or when they found it, didn't think it was particularly important. And yet, these
Yeah.
are the animals that have been so critical in changing the image for the whole group.
I think that's a great point, not only because, as you mentioned, smaller dinosaurs are easier to sort of imagine as active and running around like we think of mammals, but also because all of the dinosaurs that are most closely related to birds tend to be small to medium sized.
Yes.
Deinonychus, Troodon, these are some of the most closely related dinosaurs to birds, and they are all much closer to living bird size. And
Yes.
that's where you're going to find some of those most obvious clues.
Yeah, and some of the larger ones, there are some things that we can look back now and say this was an incredibly bird-like feature. I'm not sure how they missed it. I think on the initial Oviraptor publication that Henry Fairfield Osborn did in the 1920s, you can see the wishbone there,
Mhm.
but it wasn't really identified as such. And like we were saying, there's so much that goes on in conversation in terms of discovery that doesn't always make it to publication, doesn't always get shared as quickly as it's found. The dinosaur we now know as Allosaurus jamadsoni, when that was discovered, many decades ago, I think it was 1990 or so. So we're well into the Renaissance by that point, but still important. And that skeleton was found with an undeniable wishbone at the very front of its rib cage. But because the description took so long to do, like other publications came out with other dinosaurs that had a wishbone and had that bird trait
Right.
before that discovery. So it was known to experts, but you kind of can't talk about it until it's in the published record. So that's part of how science during this time period works as well. That it's not literally like Cope and Marsh, sending telegrams of species descriptions with all kinds of misspellings and stuff in because they're trying to outdo each other and naming every single thing. We're in an era where there are so many different interests and obligations and changes in how things are prepared and stored and everything else, where sometimes you can find a dinosaur that changes quite a bit. And it might be years, if not decades, before that tidbit of information influences what the image of dinosaurs is.
Yeah. Well, and another important aspect of that research, right? We're talking about the more detailed and diligent research. As you've mentioned a couple of times, computers are a thing now at this point, which I think one of the biggest, Riley, you mentioned earlier that paleontologists, it used to just be you literally describe the physical features of a skeleton and then compare and contrast as best you can. Computers allow us to do things like assign a number value to all of these features and then put it into a statistical analysis that will do hundreds of calculations and say, here's the most likely relationship between these, right? That's how you get to cladistics and things like that. Those kinds of quantitative studies are now possible, which allows you to go, I guess, beyond, to simplify it, what it used to be where you go, this looks kind of like a bird, to a computer being able to say, this is 92% like a bird, right? You're able to start putting numbers on these things.
Absolutely. And I think this is also a time period where there was greater sort of institutional exchange, paleontologists visiting other museums and checking out their specimens. Whereas, through the 19th and early 20th century, the reasons that museums existed were different. You were kind of, perhaps an expert who collected a whole bunch of things and you were kind of like master of that knowledge. In a way, you knew every fossil in the cabinet and you're doing all kinds of comparisons to build your research program, which was also building your reputation. The era of museum building where we had lots of specimens going out for display. And certainly there were fossil collections, but it was generally in the sense of, well, this is stuff that we also have and we might study or be informative. But I think there was a shift in the mid 20th century in terms of just like what the mission of a museum is. And I think to this day, people, they hear museum and they think of the public facing displays. But the real purpose of a museum is the long term care and storage and study of so many of these natural objects. And it's really during the Dinosaur Renaissance period, especially with air travel being much more accessible, people being willing to go, more experts in different areas that need to do comparisons, they need to travel and check things out, that necessitate a kind of collections and collections management where you have to store your fossils in such a way that they become more studyable. You can't just have a room full, as dramatic and as lovely as they are. When I look at these old photos, whether it's Aim and H or La Brea or whatever, where it's just basically a barn full of bones. I'm like, how do you not lose important stuff all the
Yep.
time in that kind of scenario? So I feel like museums also becoming much more professional in how they care for and store and catalog their fossils allowed a lot more science to be done, because then you could look in a database and see what the museum has, or you can follow along their organizational system, and it's not like appealing to the one curator who's kind of like the boss of all these fossils to see if they can remember where to pull the thing that you want to see from.
I also want to go back to another point that you mentioned earlier, which is new information about dinosaur social behavior, right? This was another one of those, again, another sort of bizarre interpretation of dinosaurs because they're reptiles being non-social, which again is not really a true thing about reptiles who, to bring it back to crocs, are very gregarious and live in groups and such. But there were also these really important discoveries. You mentioned Dinosaur Park with these bone beds. You mentioned Maiasaura. So let's go a little deeper into those. What were some of the major clues happening that allowed us to interpret dinosaurs as more social at this time?
I think paleontologists were a little bit more open to the idea, partially because there was the discovery of trackways, for example, that show multiple animals walking in the same direction, seemingly made at the same time. And saying, okay, like either this is just like the one sandbar that everybody tramples on and it's all churned up, but more likely is that we're seeing animals grouped together and finding bone beds, for example, the Centrosaurus bone bed, and there are multiple ones. I find it fascinating that during the days of the Western Interior Seaway 75 million years ago or so, you'd get these coastal storms that would kind of rip up this part of the coast. And ceratopsids are kind of front heavy, and they would drown en masse. All these different species. If you look for ceratopsid dinosaurs in like northern Montana or southern Alberta in this time period, often you're going to find them in a bone bed. The Centrosaurus one's one of the largest ones, literally thousands of individuals.
Yeah, we talked about this episode 228 about the Dinosaur Provincial Park. We talked about the famous bone beds.
Yeah, and when you find a bone bed, you always have to ask that question, right? The taphonomic question of like, were these animals washed together? Does this represent like a stressed event, like a drought or something like that? If it's only a couple of animals, if it's 3 or 5 or whatever, or you have situations like Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry where it's like multiple events over a certain amount of time. It takes a lot of disentangling, but the Centrosaurus bone bed in particular, there was no way that these animals represent this kind of time averaged thing. Like this was a massive herd of animals that lived and were killed and buried together. So there really could be no doubt about that. So we had the trackway evidence, right? This great big Centrosaurus bone bed that not only told us that, but a little bit about the way the ecosystems work. And you had these mass die-offs, and the carnivores would come in and scavenge, but then there are consequences for the ecosystem because you basically wiped out an entire generation of these animals, almost, at least locally. And what does that mean for dinosaurs? And making comparisons, I remember at the time seeing documentaries talk about like caribou migrations, where many of them might die during a flooding event. And I think that was part of it as well, that paleontologists were more willing to look for modern analogs, not just for anatomical analogs, but behavioral analogs. Where have we seen this before? And of course, Egg Mountain, as it's now known in Montana, that was not only social behavior, that you have a whole bunch of nests that are relatively close together, that were made at the same time, found in the same bedding planes. So we know that those animals must have been nesting together, which is already social. But the size of the offspring, what their individual development seemed like, being able to kind of move around but not get very far, vegetation that was found there kind of really coalesced into this picture that, it wasn't, the dinosaurs had a more complex and diverse array of sort of reproductive strategies than we thought. It wasn't just reptiles. It wasn't just like sea turtles laying a whole bunch of eggs and letting all the individual babies kind of make their own way. We think sauropods and some dinosaurs did do this, but in this case, we had direct evidence for something that was more alligator-like, something that was more bird-like. So all of these ideas, even if they weren't directly referencing each other, I think that we're finding new fossil evidence that paleontologists were not only more open to seeing, basically in detecting, because you can't hypothesize about it, you can't see it unless your mind is open to the fact it's there. Just by way of
Mhm.
counterexample, I think we're just beginning to realize how many soft tissues, feathers, skin, other aspects
Yeah.
of dinosaur soft parts that were absolutely lost because nobody thought that they were there. So they just blasted through the rock while doing
Yeah.
preparation to get to
Yeah.
the bone. And even historic specimens that we thought were kind of like that were represented as good scaly reptiles way back when have evidence of these soft tissues, and we can only really imagine what we had lost. So it was a change, I think, in the way that so much was approached. It wasn't smash and grab paleontology anymore. It wasn't just get out there and get me a big dinosaur and send it back east so I can name it and put it up in a museum. There was,
Right.
I think, the development of a lot more care, whether it was in the field, the sort of development of field techniques that were unique and
Yeah.
specific, and about getting the fossil back in such a way that the most information could be extracted from it, as well as looking at these animals and thinking where have we seen this before? Is there a modern
Hmm.
equivalent for this behavior, and finding resonance amongst animals that are alive today? It's kind of the same thing with geology. We have uniformitarianism, right? Where we're looking at the past, and we're looking at the present. There are processes that happen today that can explain what we see in the rocks, and what we see in the rocks can inform what we're seeing today. And I think paleontology took a long road to get to that moment, but oddly enough, it was having this big beat of the late 20th century had a lot to do with what geology had figured out in the 19th century, and paleontology kind of forgot a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting to think about. We mentioned that Deinonychus is sort of a pop star figure of this period, and we were just talking about nesting. And I think of kind of this is Maiasaura, the good mother lizard, as the name was intended to mean. Who I always kind of think of as the other super famous dinosaurian figure. And I think that your point is really well made, that obviously it was more complicated than there's just these two discoveries. But I do think that both of those discoveries are really notable and really famous because of how obvious they feel. That you found this Maiasaura. This is a nesting site with babies and crushed eggshells and adults, and the nests are, spaced out just enough for an adult to walk between them. And it's the kind of thing that really just slaps you in the face with the evidence of what these dinosaurs were doing. And I think that that both makes it really memorable from sort of a public understanding, but also really breaks through that barrier that you were just talking about, of when scientists do get stuck in their expectations or are accustomed to overlooking certain types of evidence. You find something like this and it kind of slaps the paleontologists in the face and says, there's really no way to interpret this. This is not a Godzilla dinosaur. These dinosaurs were like a group of seabirds nesting and taking care of their young. And it's so evident that it forces that shift.
Well, yeah, and also comparing to the discovery of Deinonychus, and looking at smaller dinosaurs, that not only does it have a bunch of evidence that it's active, but it's difficult for us to imagine it as not active. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to think of an animal that sized and that shape being sluggish like a lizard in the early morning,
Yeah.
because every animal that pops into your mind that's shaped like that isn't behaving like that. So it's you would now have to be bending over backwards to misinterpret these as sluggish, simple animals.
Yeah. And speaking of these paradigm shifts, there is one more that I do want to make sure that
Yes.
we mention from this time period. This could be an entire podcast of its own, so we don't have to go into too much detail. But as we alluded to earlier, this is also the part of the 1900s where we finally start to resolve this question of dinosaur extinction.
Yeah.
Yes, because that was always the big thing, right? It's what happened to them. Nobody knows. It was kind of a open chalkboard for whatever idea. And the Alvarez paper, as it's known, came out in Science in 1980. Looking at this iridium spike, this metal that is not often found near Earth's crust, maybe except volcanic eruptions, but it spikes in this clay layer all around the planet. They first found it in Italy, turned up in New Zealand, and all these other spots around the planet at the same time. And the only reasonable explanation that the paper could come to was that this must have been from a massive asteroid strike. It's the only thing that makes sense over this time period. And it caused, much like the asteroid itself, as we now know, a firestorm, this time of scientific controversy, because paleontologists in particular were incensed that there was not a vertebrate paleontologist on the paper, that they were not consulted or involved in some way up until this point. Most paleontologists, I feel like, didn't think that like caterpillars ate all the plant food and dinosaurs went extinct,
Sure.
because they had recognized that this was a mass extinction that affected land and sea, many different forms of life. Even the most ardent dinosaur paleontologists would have known that the end Cretaceous mass extinction was about far more than just dinosaurs. But paleontologists were really mad that, like, all of a sudden you have this outside group who says we solved it for you, basically not taking into account all the stuff about, well, climate changes and they're probably dwindling. We find the diversity is lower. They were on their way out. The Western Interior Seaway was receding. There was climate change going on. We have these massive eruptions in the Deccan Traps, what's now India. Any of those things, it seemed too clean and simple and neat of an answer that was delivered. But going to the public, that's amazing. You're telling me the Earth got hit by a 6-mile wide asteroid, and all the dinosaurs basically fell over dead within a matter of a couple of years. And this was paired, I think, with the time, this is Cold War era stuff, when everyone's thinking about, Carl Sagan, his group came out with, a study. I think it was published first, publicly, and then became a technical paper about, like, what would nuclear winter look like at these different megaton yields. And it was very, very real, this idea of how many minutes to doomsday, that, if an explosion, if an event of this scale happens, that is a global extinction. And here we're being told that it happened once before. And dinosaurs misunderstood as dominant organisms, but still that's how the public thought of them. Like, they lived on every continent, as we had recently learned. They had lived for over 150 million years. This was often a talking point. Dominant over the planet, prevented, the evolution of mammals in the public, perception. And this is what changed it. This is why they come to such a sudden ending and we don't have anymore. I think there was, like, an intuitive sense that, like, it would have to be something of that scale that immediately captured the public imagination, in addition to scientific controversy, which of course is going to interest every science journalist and science communicator on the planet, and it makes good copy. And this is why we have the cover of Time magazine considering this, and dinosaur documentaries, like one of my favorites just called Dinosaur with Christopher Reeve hosting it. Also PBS's The Dinosaurs, which soon followed, has this great animated sequence of sort of very emaciated T-Rex collapsing in this impact winter kind of scenario. And I think as much as paleontologists resisted it and were coming up with all kinds of other ideas for what it must be, it also it made this intuitive sense that after surviving for so long, because dinosaurs had lived through sea level regressions before, they lived through mountain building events and climate changes and everything else over such a span of time, continued to thrive over and over again. It would have to be something that catastrophic and sudden and violent to kind of topple them over. So this whole time period, from, even if we're just going to use it as a marker, from Deinonychus on, making them, understanding them as animals, understanding that they were likely warm-blooded and behaviorally complex and social, and some of them raised their offspring and lived in social groups, and all of this stuff, that they were even more fascinating and complex than we ever imagined, that it was kind of the perfect explanation, right? You kind of can't go back to, like, well, climate change just kind of did this whole family of organisms in very rapid order. And it was certainly an uphill battle to get it accepted. I remember even in 2010, Science had a kind of anniversary paper celebrating 30 years of this controversial Alvarez paper. And huge group of authors saying, like, this really is the consensus. We've looked at everything else. It's the impact that makes the most sense. Like, of course, if you're a little marine bivalve living in the Western Interior Seaway that's receding and the sea goes off of your habitat, of course, you'll go extinct from that. That's never going to explain 100%. But why we see this spike, why 75% of known species disappear, including all the non-avian dinosaurs, it's the asteroid. And even then, even 15 years ago, there were response papers from multiple paleontologists going like, well, wait a second, there are other things. I can't quite accept it yet.
Right.
So I feel like even my book, The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, which says like it really is the asteroid. In fact, the volcanic eruptions probably helped keep things alive rather than contributing to the extinction. If I had published that 10 or 15 years ago or so, it probably would have gotten a lot more pushback. This is still an incredibly recent idea, but it was just so critical. We can't talk about the evolution of dinosaurs and stuff without covering the ending, the grand finale, and why we only have birds as our living dinosaurs today. To make these comparisons, it was a moment of Earth history that had tremendous influence on even how we understand the science. Because imagine if some other non-avian dinosaurs survived, even just a couple that we knew of or found somewhere, then non-avian dinosaurs maybe wouldn't have seemed quite so special. As I mean, like it was this, we needed the gap to be fascinated by them. And the difference between, even though we have birds for so much information now, a bird is not an ankylosaurus, it's not a seismosaurus or whatever. So we needed this gap in time and this anatomical gap, I think, to make them what they are. So extinction and what it did and kind of what it left us to work with is such a critical part of the story.
Something that came to mind and that I've thought before about this and feels like it fits into this narrative very well, that like our previous views on dinosaurs having to have been flawed to have gone extinct. I've often felt like a very likely driver for many people to have that feeling is like, well, there has to be a reason they died out, because otherwise, if things can just randomly massively go extinct, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
And that can't happen to us. We must be better than those that went extinct. That's why we're around, and that's why we will maintain to be around. And as existentially terrifying as planet-killing asteroids are, it is a very comforting of like, it wasn't a flaw that caused them to go. Something happened. It was outside of their control, their ability to survive, and that it feels like it bridges that uncomfortable gap of this successful, big, powerful group of animals suddenly disappearing for seemingly no reason. Now there's a reason, and now it's now it makes it kind of okay for them to have been as awesome as we've been slowly coming to realize they were, because their awesomeness was killed by space, not by some inevitable internal flaw.
Entirely, yeah. It's there's nothing you can do, but there's also nothing you can do. It's this existential moment that in some ways makes the dinosaurs, even cooler in retrospect, because it's like it took something, the absolute worst case scenario of all worst case scenario. There have been other impacts. There have been other impacts that have made bigger craters since that time that did not trigger mass extinctions. And this was absolutely like every worst option it checked off on the menu, and it took something that devastating to end, the thriving of the non-avian dinosaurs. We're still finding, even as of a couple of weeks ago, that we were underestimating their diversity at the end of the Cretaceous. There are probably a whole bunch of species and ecosystems that we're barely just getting to know from that time period. And not even if the asteroid impact were canceled, because I know that's the easiest way to think about it. We've seen this in a ton of movies and media and stuff of all sorts. But even if it hit at a different speed, it hit a different target rock, it hit at a different angle, it hit at a different part of the Earth's rotation, the mass extinction might have either been much more limited or not happened at all, or maybe it would have even been worse. So it really is this moment, like there's so few things that we can point to and say it was this is the moment, this is the exact moment in time, because even the other 4 big mass extinctions that we identify in the fossil record took hundreds of thousands of years, 1,000,000 years, maybe more than that. Volcanic eruptions, climate change, back and forth, and hot and cold. This took place in 3 years, and most of the non-avian dinosaurs were dead within 24 hours. What the heck happened? Like that is in applying that to the dinosaurs, it makes them like, yeah, it took something that devastating to make the world as we know it.
Yeah, I think that the extinction the study of it, the realization, that scientific discovery, as it is, of this extinction event is the perfect punctuation is maybe a little too strong of a word, but it is the perfect culmination of this time period of dinosaur renaissance discoveries, that we're learning that these weren't this outdated group. They weren't sluggish and ill prepared. They were active, and they lived in big groups, and they took care of their young, and they were a lot like birds, and birds are more diverse today than mammals are. There are like it from the 60s into the 70s, it just makes less and less sense that dinosaurs didn't make it because something was wrong with them, because they were just waiting around for something better to come along. That asteroid discovery is sort of the perfect cap on top of that to go, yeah, and here it is. It
Mhm.
wasn't, it was a tragedy. In fact, it is, when I think about it for too long, it makes me extremely sad,
Oh yeah.
because at the end of the Cretaceous, dinosaurs were kind of doing the best that they had ever done. And then this tragedy happens, and that's what did it. That sort of wraps up this whole new image of dinosaurs in a nice, tidy little bow to say, yeah, they were extremely successful and extremely awesome. And the only reason they're gone is because, as Will pointed, they got attacked by space. Like they got like a Justice League level event happened,
Yeah,
and
Independence
that's what
Day
it took.
happened.
Yes.
Well, and it dovetailed perfectly with some of the other science that was going on at the time, because I remember this was in the, and you can find all these on YouTube still, if you want a little trip down memory lane, or perhaps to see like what old timers like me used to see as kids. But in the PBS series Infinite Voyage, The Great Dinosaur Hunt, and Dinosaur with Christopher Reeve on PBS as the dinosaurs, they all had segments in one form or the other, usually towards the end, saying, but some dinosaurs survived.
Yes.
Some paleontologists think they were still kind of handling this very, very gingerly. I think some
Mhm.
paleontologists think that birds are dinosaurs because of the connections between Deinonychus and Archaeopteryx, because of all these other things, like these little species that had so fundamentally, questioned what the image of dinosaurs was like. So it all came back around again to that initial, like how the dinosaur renaissance really got going, with the inspiration from these smaller species, and just that
Yeah.
tantalizing possibility. It was like, we have an explanation for why they're all gone, but they're not all gone.
Mhm.
And that added
Oh.
this next little hook to it. And I just remember seeing that when I was like, and it was just so perfect. It was something that, like, again, it just made this intuitive sense. You could see the resemblances, even if a paleontologist might say, like, well, we're not really sure, it might be these thecodont
Mhm.
reptiles, we don't have the transitional fossils yet, and be very, very careful and very, very qualified. But anytime that you saw, like, in animation or a screen dissolve or whatever else, that Coelurosaur turned into a feathered bird, it's like, yeah, that's almost the same animal. How could
Yep.
this not be true? It has to be true.
Yeah. Well, that is one of my most satisfying things as a paleontologist nowadays, is getting to say birds are dinosaurs, because of all the things I had as a kid that had that in cap of, and then we've got birds, and I don't know, sure seem like there might be something going on between these two, but it was always very like teaser, and
Yes.
was not solid. And nowadays I get to just say, no, birds are dinosaurs. They are our modern dinosaurs. They're the dinosaurs that made it. It's as straightforward and simple as that, and it makes me happy every time I get to say it.
So let's talk about art, because this is something that Will and I have discussed on the podcast a whole bunch, that almost uniquely among scientific disciplines, paleontology is made up in part of artwork. You really cannot have paleontology like we have it without the contributions of paleo artists reconstructing these animals. So in the dinosaur renaissance, right, obviously this isn't just our understanding of dinosaurs changing, it's how we depict them. So, how did this dinosaur renaissance affect paleo art, and vice versa? How was art helping to further this shift?
I'm glad that you brought up the issue of reciprocity here, because it's not separate. It's not like, paleontologists and scientists just kind of give us the data and that gets transformed to an artist's interpretation. I remember once seeing, a couple of years ago, seeing the paleontologists present about research on Utahraptor and their claws and what they use their claws for. And at the very beginning, it's like, well, this wouldn't make sense for a pack hunting animal. Or if it's like, do we know that? I don't think there's any research on that. That's the Jurassic Park interpretation. But like there's certain things in media and in films that are almost taken as a scientific standard or a hypothesis by researchers that then involves what they're thinking about in terms of their research, which then influences the art. So much of it is wrapped up all together. The way that during the Dinosaur Renaissance and afterwards, again, it's this period not just of scientific interest but of dinomania. There is a hunger for dinosaur stuff in all manner of magazines, museum exhibits. We see, Dynamation, these animatronic dinosaurs that like would tour. And, I remember seeing ads and going to some of these, like coming to your town at whatever local museum. And you start seeing not only more upright, active, kind of behavioral, interesting dinosaurs that are kind of constantly moving around and they're making sounds and stuff. They're still very monstery in a lot of, sort of public consumption depictions of dinosaurs. The dinosaurs you see in a cartoon or a cereal box or whatever. But in the pages of Scientific American, in books like Gregory S. Paul's Predatory Dinosaurs of the World, and a lot of these things like for the semi-technical dinosaur nerds, someone who's not a paleontologist but they're interested, we start to see dinosaurs that are feathery. They're much more bird-like in a lot of ways, have a lot more interesting patterns. Colors was such a big thing. I remember this was an era where everyone would say like, okay, we don't know what color dinosaurs are. For whatever reason, everyone picked flamingo pink. I guess it was the 80s, and that was on everybody's mind. The forgotten synthwave past that also affected dinosaurs. But because no one knew, who could say you were wrong? And they might be more reserved or have more of a camouflage. And I think of some of like Eli Kish's art, which is absolutely fantastic. I feel like her art sometimes gets the criticism is too harsh for shrink wrapping or whatever. But if you look at the behaviors and the patterns and the habitats and stuff, it's really, really wonderful. So you'll have paleo art that's like that, still showing dinosaurs as active, dynamic, interesting. And then you'll have sort of the big dino encyclopedias are trying to catch you up real fast and all these new species all of a sudden that we are talking about. And some of those, bright yellows and pinks and oranges and blues and greens. And, the palette expanded beyond gray and kind of drab earth tones. It gave people like, well, if these are more behaviorally complex animals, and we see animals around us today like birds and even many reptiles that are very brightly colored, use those patterns and those colors as part of their communication or blending in or what have you. Maybe the same is true for the non-avian dinosaurs. So I feel like beyond just like the posing and showing them do more interesting things, like taking it back to Deinonychus, every illustration of Deinonychus, I feel like for a time, it was obligated to have them jumping on the back of a Tenontosaurus, this herbivorous ornithopod that was found sometimes in the same quarries. Like I know there's at least one in Oklahoma where they're associated together. So it was assumed, okay, we have all these Deinonychus shed teeth and stuff like that. That's, since then we think it's more likely to be like the same way crocodiles might aggregate to feed on a carcass, where they're not necessarily socially helping each other, but like there's enough food that they're just kind of doing their thing and leaving a lot of shed teeth and stuff behind. But at the time, this is the genesis of Clever Girl and pack hunting in Jurassic Park. It was thought that you're going to have a way to take down a big herbivore is to have all these small dinosaurs jumping onto it and ripping it to ribbons, which is a very new and very violent and very dramatic way of looking at these animals. Because previously, paleontologists would think about, okay, how does like something like a T-Rex eat? Always be this big lumbering kind of carnivore that might like challenge another from across the floodplain and run them off their kill and just gorge itself and then kind of totter along to the next thing. It was very Godzilla-like in its way. And that's of course like wrapped up in Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park exists because of the Dinosaur Renaissance that Michael Crichton wrote Westworld as the movie about a theme park where the robots don't do what they're supposed to and go after the tourists, and it wasn't exactly a great hit. It's like, okay, well maybe I'll do this again. I like prehistoric stuff. I think I have an idea for how I can bring dinosaurs back to life. Does the same thing over again with Jurassic Park, and looks at Gregory S. Paul's Predatory Dinosaurs of the World to get inspiration. Picks up on Deinonychus, which Paul tried to rename Velociraptor in that volume.
Mm-hmm.
molds all this together, but we also have T-Rex as the other star. So you have basically these two flavors of dinosaurs. You have the revamped supercharged T-Rex, which is like the fan favorite. Everybody knows you got to have it in the movie. And this dinosaur that nobody's heard of other than
Mm-hmm.
maybe a handful of experts and diehard dinosaur fans, representing the new image of what dinosaurs are, that they aren't all big, that some of the scariest ones might in fact be small. Melding that fear and fascination together. And how that influence certainly got a whole new generation of people into paleontology a number of years ago. It's cooled down since then, but there would be back and forth in papers about T-Rex running speed, I think partially inspired by that film, saying how could it actually run as fast as is depicted. I've heard John Hutchinson, who also did this research, just to spoil that particular nugget of it. The speedometer is wrong. The T-Rex run cycle seems to be right. It seems to be running at about the speed a T-Rex would top out as. They just make it seem faster with that little bit of movie
Yeah.
back and forth. But that's all these
Yes.
considerations that get into this, is that we can start to talk about biomechanics and movement. How fast were they? And looking at tracks to calculate, walking or running speeds. And all these behaviors that before it's well, of course it walked around. There's not really anything else to think about there. And now it started becoming well, how fast were they? And how did they do it? And how much would they have to eat in order to do that? What kind of body temperature? So it was really one question or one discovery led to the next thing. And we really see that in the art, as I don't want to say conservative, but as kind of reined in as sometimes it was. It was a paradigm shift, but at the same time, it was hewing very close to the bone that you'd sometimes get a little further out, saying maybe feathers were more common than we thought, maybe the colors were brighter than we thought, maybe this behavior is plausible because we can see it in living animals. So that was really this idea of making dinosaurs less these statuesque forms that were just meant to impress you, but more okay, how does this animal live? How am I going to
Mm-hmm.
restore this? And
Yeah.
again, that was in some ways a return to the paleo art of the late 19th century and very beginning of the 20th, the sort of the Charles R. Knight and um, a lot of his contemporaries who would create these lush, even if they're inaccurate, say they'd still be fully realized kind of ecosystems and scenes within it about these interactions. And now it was kind of being done all over again with these new dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that it's really important to emphasize the value of that art because it really does. You've mentioned this many times in this discussion that sometimes you see an interpretation and it just makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's really interesting to look back at a lot of those old school reconstructions of dinosaurs, and they're outdated, and there's also sorts of stuff that's wrong about them that we know now. But another thing that always really strikes me about them is how little they often look like animals.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, obviously, a lot of it is movies and they're being all monstery, but there is something about looking at a really detailed bit of artwork or a really detailed animation of the dinosaur walking around and just going, yeah, that's how animals move.
Mm-hmm.
That is how an animal looks. That is an expression that an animal has, and it really emphasizes that is a realistic interpretation. That is
Mm-hmm.
something. You don't have to break any bones to get it into that shape. You don't have to invent a new type of animal. That's just what animals are like.
Yeah.
And I also like that you've brought us to what I think is the inevitable conclusion of the discussion of the dinosaur renaissance, if it in fact has a conclusion, which is Jurassic Park, which I think is really, so much of this is happening, as you've alluded to, in scientific discussions and in documentaries and books, the kinds of things that are written or created, if not for paleontologists, for people who are interested in it. Jurassic Park really is the thing that takes all of that and puts it in a format that anybody can now appreciate and enjoy. There's a lot to create. Will and I have talked at length about Jurassic Park. I think that if you are a vertebrate paleontologist, you have talked at length about Jurassic Park. It's part of the deal. But there's a lot to say about the movie. There's a lot to criticize about the movie. But it really is, this paradigm shift was not happening in a dramatically public space. It was happening sort of gradually. It was happening in all these different places. Jurassic Park was really the vehicle that went, all right, and here it is as a fire hose injected into public consciousness. And, we mentioned Velociraptor before. Velociraptor was named, I think, in 1923 or 24, and then it became a household name the weekend of June 11th, 1993. Right now, everyone and their dog knows the word Velociraptor. This was such a colossal influence. And obviously, Jurassic Park gets a lot of attention, but 5 years before Jurassic Park, The Land Before Time is a movie about a bunch of baby dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Right. The idea we were talking about, dinosaurs as good parents was something that had just been sort of popularized and recognized a decade ago. And now you get to have this movie where the big, like, emotionally traumatic moment for all of the kids is this relationship between this dinosaur and its loving parents. And it's such a poignant representation of what we have been alluding to this whole conversation, that link between the culture
Yeah.
and the science that was going on. Land Before Time could not have happened without all of those discoveries, right? We could not be scarred by that terribly depressing scene in Land Before Time without that realization that this was how dinosaurs were.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember once I was asked to do a talk at the Tellus Museum outside Atlanta, Georgia, and it was right after a showing of The Land Before Time, and I'm wiping away tears and stuff because I was 5 when I saw that in the theater, and I cannot talk about Littlefoot's mom for any length of time without starting to tear up all over again. But as you say, it was believable. It made
Yeah.
sense
Mm-hmm.
in some way. It was this early kind of representation, an early vision of this image, because the dinosaurs in that, you are right, as much as Jurassic Park is currently the touchstone and that franchise continues on and on and on, The Land Before Time kind of did it first. Maybe not entirely the same way, because it was a cartoon. The animals are much more kind of, they're distorted compared to the fossils, and carrying different kind of hero and villain beats and all that sort of stuff, but they're
Mm-hmm.
still much more complex and active and interesting than anything that we'd gotten before. If someone had tried to make a baby dinosaur movie in the 1960s or something like that, it would be very, very different. Even when those animals would be depicted, in animatronic displays or otherwise, it'd usually be just like a whole bunch of little babies kind of twitching around eggs.
Right.
And that's more or less it. Nobody really thought, like, what is it like to grow up as a baby dinosaur. In fact, we mentioned Maiasaura a few times. There was a whole book, I think, called Maya, Baby Dinosaur Grows Up, with fantastic artwork by Douglas Henderson. It really was a narrative story bringing this to the public, and people were ready for it. I remember being in preschool, and my preschool had a dinosaur night where, like, there was a sandbox with little dinosaur toys in it, and you went home with a box of dinosaur cereal. I had to dress up, I think as a stegosaurus, I think, to do a little dinosaur skit, and I remember getting it in front of all the parents because I was supposed to lose to this Allosaurus. And it's like, well, that probably wouldn't happen, and this is why, and herbivores are dangerous too, all that kind of stuff. And that was encouraged at the time. It really all went together, where I feel like we can't talk about the dinosaur renaissance like as only a scientific moment. It very much involved public input and public reaction. And Jurassic Park, we can go on and on about it, I'm sure, but it still stands out from all of its successors, from every other movie that's tried to do the same thing, because you can only do that trick once. It really was the world's introduction to the new dinosaurs, explaining these connections, which is always going to be weird for as much as the movies haven't wanted to put feathers on their dinosaurs, how much the beat of, like, their birds, they're bird-like. Look at how bird-like this is. One of the last shots is pelicans, and Grant kind of sighing, like, yep, we're still in the world of the dinosaurs. Like, that's very much in that first one. And it set this image that, like, not only popularized it and did a lot of great things for science, but also kind of trapped us in a way. The fact that, like, if you ask somebody to envision a velociraptor, it's going to be the kind of gnarly, scaly ones from 1993 that's still stuck in the public's head. So it was made with a lot of love and a ton of scientific input, bringing in paleontologists, doing all these sketches and animatics and thinking about go motion versus CGI and what's going to look best and all that kind of stuff to really bring this image to life in a way. It has plenty of scientific problems, but I don't think any movie has put in the same amount of scientific effort into trying to get their dinosaurs correct and up to date as that first film.
and I think that it was many years ago. I was doing a little personal project where I was just collecting the titles of as many dinosaur movies as I could. And I remember noticing in my list, which I'm sure was incomplete, that the number of dinosaur movies per decade was like fairly consistent from like the 50s through the 80s or so. And then in the 90s, it like tripled that. And I'm sure that part of that is the movie industry changing and all that, but just this public interest in dinosaurs following this period of the dinosaur revolution. I always like to reflect with deep pity that there were like 3 or 4 other dinosaur movies that came out in 1993.
Yes.
And because like Carnosaur and
Yes.
Prehysteria and We're Back, I think all also came back in '93. And I always look at these and I'm like, you poor movies. You came out the same year as Jurassic Park. But there was this huge shift in public understanding of dinosaurs and public interest of dinosaurs. And it does kind of feel like we're waiting for the next one. Like there's a Jurassic Park esque film or something that is going to eventually get to come around and cause that cultural paradigm shift again.
This is one of the reasons I resent the more recent Jurassic World films, because one of their persistent beats is that nope, they're asking us to pay, $12 a ticket plus popcorn, drink, or whatever for a dinosaur movie that tells us no one's interested in dinosaurs anymore.
Yep.
Yes.
And
Yep.
it drives me up the wall. I think I want to believe that we can have another moment in my very distant dreams that I'm sure I will never get to. I hope that one day I will pen some kind of novel or something that'll get to be a movie, and I can say like, okay, now I'm calling the shots, and the dinosaurs are going to be good the way I want them to be,
Yeah.
The
and have
Great
this kind of
Cretaceous
moment.
novel.
Yes. But I think it's going to be unlikely that we have a Jurassic Park moment again, mostly because the media landscape has changed and the fact that it's so fragmented now. And
Yeah.
it's not just in our phones and online, but the movies that we like, the books that we read, the music we listen to and stuff, it's so individual and it's great. There's so much creative stuff out there. But during the 1990s in particular, look at the numbers for how many people went to see these movies, or how many people watched the X-Files on a given week, or how many people were looking at this or that television program. The whole idea of water cooler culture. Did you see the movie? Did you see the show while it was in theaters or while it was being broadcast? Because if you didn't, it might be years before you catch that thing again, or you have to wait for the VHS, or you have to wait for the sequel, which could be 4 or 5 or whatever years down the line. And everything is so immediate and so fast and so fragmented that it's going to be difficult to have that same cultural moment where like this is the thing that everybody is going to see to reinvigorate that interest. I think it
Yeah.
might be possible, but the conditions under which it would happen, where we get like another kind of burst of updated dinosaurs, it's hard to see what the road to that would look like. And that's part of what makes this time period so peculiar, is I think the way that media was created and marketed and ingested by the public really allowed the dinosaur renaissance and dinomania to be what it was, in a way that like, yeah, we have all these things today, but unless you were there in the 80s and 90s, like you really have no idea at how pervasive just the
Yeah.
love of dinosaurs was.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, speaking of our present times, I want to wrap up our conversation with one last question. And it's a question that was foreshadowed way back at the beginning of this discussion. It is, as of this recording and release, the middle of the 2020s. Riley, are we still in the dinosaur renaissance? Or are we in a new, yet to be named or recognized era of paleontology?
I feel like I should have a much more concise answer to this after all this discussion.
Our audience is very used to
Yes.
incomplete answers because
Yes.
it's all science.
On the one hand, I think that we still are, and that our vision of dinosaurs as animals, that we want to understand not just that they existed, but how they lived, how they interacted with each other, what their world was like, that it's us reaching across this gap with a bit of empathy, trying to understand what were these creatures like, and what was their world like, that fueled so much of the Renaissance, that sense of curiosity. it's still very much there. And we're still talking about some of the same things. We're still finding new things out about their extinction, about why birds survived out of all of them, about dinosaur physiology. There are new papers every year where it seems like, we have it settled. It's like maybe sauropods are a little bit more ectothermic than we thought, and that's why they lived in lower latitudes. Or maybe they're different physiological regimes. Like, after all, mammals have all sorts of different physiologies, even though we always say that we're warm-blooded. It's not that simple. We're still having a lot of these discussions, and I think that's partially generational, that a lot of the paleontologists who are foundational to the Renaissance are still here, and they've trained students who have also trained students, and a lot of these ideas and interests and stuff that shape how the science is done are still very much in play. At the same time, I feel like we have entered a new era, because I feel like the Dinosaur Renaissance was also sort of a specific media environment. It wasn't just about the scientific questions. It was a time period where there were more dinosaur paleontologists than before, but still relatively few. That if you made these big discoveries, you kind of became, for better or worse, a personality and someone who was bringing the science directly to the public. And the specialization that I think has occurred since then, in terms of having researchers who may never go into the field at all, that they do entirely CT scanning or geochemical isotope testing, stuff entirely from the lab, that the science has diversified in such a way in terms of approaches and specializations and what you study, and it's grown to such a large size that we don't have a small number of people who are kind of leading the big debates. Like, this is like this particular researcher who has this controversial hypothesis, and there's this small group cluster of people who all agree with them, and then we have the opposing team and all that kind of stuff. It's much more diffuse now, because there's so much to do, there's so much to talk about, and so much to study. So I think my ultimate answer would be, like, I think we're out of the dinosaur renaissance. I think the dinosaur renaissance was really a time that was marked by the media that was surrounding it, and also these big questions that were incredibly controversial at the time. The sort of the very active debate, kind of putting things out there that seemed just like on the very edge of, is this possible? And now many of those things that seemed far out then, everybody knows now. Like, we know birds are dinosaurs, and we're starting to get to know dinosaur colors. And so many of these things that we're told that we never ever know, we have so much more insight into and so much more detail into. I'm not sure what this time period that we're in now would be called. I feel like it's really been the past 15 years or so. I think a lot of it can be marked by an interest in dinosaur origins and going back to the Triassic and trying to figure out these big evolutionary questions of how is the dinosaur tree of life arranged, and all these groups that we didn't know existed before, and a new phase that's less focused on North America and the US specifically, but very much more like developing paleontology in other parts of the world where those fossils are from. That we've seen the development, the rise of paleontology and across South America, across Eastern Asia, developing in different parts of Africa now. That the importance of, like, not being smash and grab, and we go to other countries and do parachute science and send all the fossils back to the US or England and study them. But this is a global endeavor that really was picking up in the 1990s and is super apparent now. So I think it's a much messier time. It's not as neat and concise because the field is so big. So I'm not even sure what I would call it. But yeah, I think the Renaissance I would probably mark as the 1960s through the 1990s, and basically, if we want to pick a date, post Jurassic Park, I think is our next era.
That's what I was gonna say. Kind of, if I were asked to put a date on it, I think I kind of imagined the dinosaur renaissance is 1969 with Deinonychus to 1993 with Jurassic Park. That kind of, and if I were going to have to pick a date for whatever this next one is, I'm tempted to say 1996, which is the publication of Sinosauropteryx, and
Yes.
the first non-avian dinosaur with feathers, which also, not only is that the era of feathered dinosaurs based on direct scientific evidence, it's also a specimen from Eastern Asia, and it sort of brought a whole lot of attention to that part of the world where we have now found a bajillion more feathered dinosaurs. It really is, and it's very interesting to be this age where, I was not quite 5 when Jurassic Park came out, and so it wasn't this turning point for me, because by the time I was old enough to be aware of the world, Jurassic Park was just part of the world.
Yes.
And once Jurassic Park became part of the world, there was no going. It was like Star Wars. Like Jurassic Park has happened, and now the world is different. You live in the post Jurassic Park world. Everybody knows Jurassic Park. Everyone references it. Everybody has seen this movie. So my whole life, and especially my whole time as a paleontologist, has been in this new time period. It has been. I was of that age when I went, a dinosaur with feathers. How cool. That was the big turning point. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. This conversation has been so much fun. We are going to start making our way toward the end of it. Before that, if either of you has something else you want to mention about the Dinosaur Renaissance before we get to our patron questions.
I'll make one more point, and I'm glad that you brought up Sinosauropteryx, in that we've talking about the history of paleontology and where it developed, and for so long it was very much a thing in the West. It was Western Europe, jumps over to the United States. It was very colonialist and parachute science from there. Imagine for a moment, there's no way to fully imagine this because it's really another timeline, but imagine if paleontology as we know it developed in Eastern Asia first, or that was the most influential place for it, and that we started getting non-avian dinosaurs with feathers and of all these different body sizes much earlier in the development in the field, that if we had a more complete picture of what a dinosaur looked like from the outset, if there were to be named dinosaurs at all, but if the first member of this group to be identified was a small, fluffy, feathery theropod kind of thing, how different this conversation would be, how different our image of dinosaurs might be right now. So I always love bringing this back to the Stephen Jay Gould point, because I guess I'm always going to be doing that for my whole career. That aspect of contingency, that this history that we're talking about was not inevitable, that this is a development of ideas that very much has to do with the times and the places and the social interests involved in them. And it could have turned out very, very differently. And I think that's what I'm excited for in this moment, that now that we are getting a much more global view of dinosaurs, a much more global discipline of paleontology with people all around the world from all different sorts of backgrounds, speaking all sorts of languages and all different kinds of cultural contexts, how is this further going to change how we understand our favorite prehistoric reptiles? I'm very excited to see what happens next.
Yeah.
So much fun to think about. Listeners, we encourage you, if you are the novelist type, to concoct an alternate science history story where the Bone Wars took place in the Liaoning province, and it was, fighting over the Jahol biota, and that was the start of paleontology as we know it. Riley, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for joining us and for waxing poetic with us about dinosaur paleontology history. I could continue talking about this with you for several more hours, and I'm sure that many of our listeners would love to listen to that, but unfortunately, we do all have to go to bed eventually. Before we finally wrap up, there is one more section for us to do, and that is our patron questions. Every episode of the podcast, we like to answer questions from patrons. If you are a patron who supports us at a certain level, you get to submit questions for us to answer here on the podcast. I have selected 2 questions for us to answer just briefly, but I think that these are 2 questions that, Riley, you are a perfect guest to answer these with us. The first is from Peter, who asks, if you could go back in time, which historic paleontologist or naturalist would you most like to meet, and what reassuring information from the future would you give them?
Wow. See, this is one of those, like when somebody asks me, like, this is almost like a what's your favorite dinosaur question. It's like, hold on, there's so many.
Yes.
I mean, the name that comes up first on my head is Annie Montague Alexander, paleontologist who mostly did work on marine reptiles rather than dinosaurs, but in Southern California, very much involved in developing the University of California at Berkeley museum and zoology and paleontology programs there, and just wanting to know what it was like, especially in that era. I mean, the biography about her that I have is called On Her Own Terms. And just to hear the stories and understand what it was like to be a woman in paleontology who made that space for herself. And I think it would be a joy to be able to share that and say that, like, what she was doing at the time that seems so exceptional, and she had to basically chip out of the society around her for herself. That there are so many diverse people in the field now that also look to her as an example that we can make this space in science in the field, and that our questions and our backgrounds, our perspectives mean something. So I think that would be my number one person to go visit.
That is an excellent choice. The only example that I could think of to add onto that is almost the exact same answer for Mary Anning, with
Yep.
the additional caveat that I would want to go back and meet her at a very particular point in time so that I could run in and grab her dog
Yes.
out from under the falling rocks,
Yes.
so that then she could also have her dog.
Excellent pick.
Our second question, Will, did you have an answer to that?
No, that was mine
Okay, cool.
as well. So yes.
Our second question is from Theo Proterozoic, who asks, do you have any advice for amateur paleontologists who want to contribute to science communication?
So the great thing about science communication right now is that there's so many ways to do it. You have so many platforms and outlets. All of them are a pain in the butt in their own way and have their own limitations and concerns associated with them. However, whether it's on a social media platform, whether it's taking video or photos, creating art, writing, think about what you love to do, how you love to express this enthusiasm, whether it's through words, through videos, through music, through drawing, through ZBrush and 3D modeling, like whatever it is. But if you can find that, and then you can find a community of people to share that with, not even necessarily for the niche paleo interest, but just share something in connection with that, I think that's where you're really going to grow a platform to communicate from and share this to people who might not know these things and will be fascinated by them. If we just hang out with other science-minded people all the time where they hang out, we're mostly talking to each other. But if we want to do outreach, we want to communicate science and really share, look for those other commonalities, there's other fandoms, there's other interests, and just what platform or what mode of communicating suits you best. I think so often, it used to be early on, like if you were on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, you had most of your bases covered. You could cross post all of them or whatever. We're in a very different social media ecosystem now for a variety of reasons. So that's kind of impossible to do, to be everywhere. But even if you just pick one, pick two, whatever communities you're attached to, there's got to be something there where you can take what you love doing, what makes you happy, and translate paleo into it. That's the science is there. How you express it, find your joy in that, and people will pick up on it.
Absolutely. That's often the advice I would give to people who would, or like people I was training, is keep your eye out for the overlaps when if you're working a job right now that's not related to it, but there are opportunities to sneak in fun facts. There are opportunities to sneak in a level of creativity that can work this in. That can become a Venn diagram that is a new overlap, that you can now have a niche, you can now have a speciality to fill and bring a new approach to it.
Yeah. And one of the things that is nice about our current sort of media landscape is that it's in many ways easier now to create wide reaching content than it has ever been. You can, it's hard to be everywhere, but making TikTok videos is so easy. And, writing, if you like writing, there are tons of places where you can put your writing up. There's a lot of, it really does start with doing it, pick a platform, make some really shoddy content, and then keep making it better.
Yeah.
Yep.
You learn by doing it. That's the thing. It's whatever creative thing that you do, it's always gonna probably fall a little bit short of what you see in your head. But by doing it, you get better every single time. It's just the time that you put into it.
Yeah. Aspire to the day where you can look back on your early work and cringe at it.
Yes.
That's where you'll know you've been making some progress and success. Where we've talked about this on the podcast, where people who are like, "Oh, I love the podcast. I'm starting at the beginning," and we're like, "Why? Don't do that. Those are the worst episodes."
The pre-mic days.
Yeah, before we knew how to talk.
Yeah,
we would talk so slow.
Yeah,
I listened to our earliest episodes, and I'm like, how did anyone listen to this? We're talking at like 3 words a minute. This is awful.
Yep.
I feel the same way about my books. It's like, look, I've written best-selling and award-winning books, and I look back at some things and they're like, you don't have to go back to that one. That's okay. Like I finished a book that's coming out in the fall of next year, and I'm already going like, is this any good? I just have to like, you have that sheet of eventually your successes are the things you feel good about. It's like, no, I know I'm capable of this. I know I'm doing a good thing.
Yes. Riley, once again, thank you so much for joining us. This has been so much fun. You are an expert at framing discussions like this in very, not only ways that are engaging, but also thought provoking. I feel like I'm been so inspired by this conversation to think about paleontology history in different contexts in different ways.
I'm thrilled to hear that. That's what I always hope for. Like, I don't care if anybody like remembers a specific or can say something back to me. I just want folks to find their curiosity and think whatever sparked your imagination from this. It's always delightful, and I'm sure it won't be the last time. So thank you so much for having me on to talk about this formative time in paleontology and for myself. I really am a kid of the dinosaur renaissance, so it's been wonderful getting to enthuse about it.
Please let our listeners know where they can find you and what projects that you have either recent or upcoming that you're most excited about.
So the easiest ways to find me online are rileyblack.net, which is my website, or on Blue Sky at restingdinoface.bluesky.social. And I had 2 books out this year, When the Earth Was Green, which was on I was on here last time to talk about, all about paleobotany and the relationship between animals and plants through time. In June, I had The Shortest History of the Dinosaurs come out, which is a Dinosaur 101 crash course, talk about some of the stuff that we talked about here, but very much faster in the book than on this. But that's a good, like, if you want to catch up with dinosaurs as we know them now, that's a good one. But what I'm really excited about is I'm just wrapping up the copy edits on my next book, which is Tyrant Lizard Queen. It's a narrative life of a T-Rex from the time that she hatches through adulthood. I gave a name to this dinosaur. Her name is Snaggletooth. That's our protagonist. But trying to bring as much science as I possibly can to this and update it. I actually have to update a couple of things because of certain Nanotyrannus paper that came out a couple of weeks ago, which probably better that I can do those updates, but close to the line. But that's supposed to come out in fall of next year. I think we get a release date early in December. So just keep that on your radar. But it's super fun. I tried to really bring what the life of a T-Rex would be like. All the stuff that we're talking about, in this episode about the history of how we came to these thoughts. This is getting to play with dinosaurs in the sandbox, knowing all that stuff. So I'm very excited about that coming out next year.
Excellent. And for framing, for our listeners, we are recording this toward the end of 2025, but this will be coming out early 2026. So that book is actually coming out this year when you're listening to this. That is later in 2026. So keep an eye out for that. Listeners, make sure that you check out the blog post that will be on our website associated with this episode of the podcast. We'll have links to important and fun places for more information. I'll ask Riley for some favorite places to send people. We'll have some pictures. I'm sure I can dig up some historic pictures of John Ostrom and some of the other big name people who were here. Check that out. Thank you to all of the people who requested this topic. Thank you to all of our listeners and our supporters on Patreon. And a special thanks to our top tier patrons, Sarah May, Jeff Ellington, and Danielle Loves Bugs. This episode is our Darwin Day episode, so this will be coming out in mid-February, and the only thing that I can think that I know is going to be happening around that time is we will be partway through releasing our special February series, Poke-E, where we will be speculatively evolving Pokemon as a spin-off of our Spook-E series. So that's probably halfway through happening, so go check that out. We release episodes every fortnight. We will be back in 2 weeks from this release date to talk about some other stuff that I don't know what it's going to be yet. One last final time, Riley, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. We get to yap dinosaurs. I love it. Thank you.
And listen, any excuse to yap dinosaurs. So listeners, go to the topic request form on our website and put more dinosaur yappy topics that you want us to talk about, and maybe we can find an excuse to bring Riley back and talk about some of those. Give a name to whatever the current era of dinosaur paleontology is, and then request that, and then we'll do an episode about that.
I like it.
Yes.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.